Chapter 1. The Legend of Romulus and Remus. At the beginning of the history of Rome, there is a legend that has been told in its power and symbolism for thousands of years. The legend of Romulus and Remus. These two brothers, twins, were not only mythical figures, but embodiments of the forces that shaped the Roman self-image, struggle, fate, sacrifice, and the will to rule. Its history combined divine descent with human tragedy and made Rome a city that from the beginning had a destiny beyond the ordinary. Legend has it that Numitor, the rightful king of Alba Longa, was ousted from the throne by his brother Amulius. Amulius wanted to secure his rule and forced Rhea Silvia, the daughter of Numitor, to become a priestess of Vesta, so that she would remain celibate and not produce any descendants who could jeopardize his claim to the throne. But fate could not be stopped. Mars, the god of war, united with Rhea Silvia, and she gave birth to twins, Romulus and Remus. From the very beginning, this divine descent was the destiny of the brothers not to live ordinarily, but to become rulers and shapers of a new world. Amulius, however, feared for his power and ordered the children to be thrown into the Tiber. But the servants who were supposed to carry out this order hesitated and instead abandoned the twins in a basket that floated down the river. The stream carried them to the shore, where a she-wolf found the abandoned children. Instead of tearing them apart, she suckled the brothers with her milk. This image of the she-wolf nourishing the children became the archetype of Rome, a symbol of ferocity, strength, but also of protection and care. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus found the twins and took them into his house, where they grew into strong youths. Her extraordinary nature became apparent early on. They distinguished themselves by courage, energy, and leadership, led other shepherds and stood up against robbers and injustice. Eventually, they learned the truth about their origins and killed Amulius, returning the throne to their grandfather Numitor. But the brothers wanted more. They didn't just want to restore the old, they wanted to create something new. A city that belonged to them, that embodied their own power and their own destiny. Thus they came to the place where the Tiber formed a shallow ford, near the Seven Hills. There they wanted to found the new city. But now a dispute broke out that was to determine the tragedy of her life. Romulus preferred the Palatine, Remus, on the other hand, the Aventine. They looked for divine signs, for the will of the gods, to make the decision. Remus saw 6 vultures, but Romulus saw 12, and both claimed victory. The charged atmosphere escalated. When Romulus began to build the walls of his city, Remus mocked him and jumped over the still low walls. But Romulus killed his brother in anger and spoke the words that became the bitter motto, "May it be so with everyone who dares to cross the walls of my city." The fratricide was a terrible beginning, but at the same time a sign of fate. Rome was to be a city born of blood and sacrifice, a city that gained its greatness through toughness and determination. Romulus became the first king. He gave his name to the city, he ordered its institutions, created the first laws and made it a community of warriors ready to carry on the legacy of the she-wolf. The story of Romulus and Remus is not a simple founding legend, but a reflection of Roman identity. It shows that Rome did not come into being through peaceful harmony, but through struggle, sacrifice, and the will to prevail. The divine origin through Mars, the rescue by the she-wolf, the fratricide, and the founding of the city. All this made Rome a place that was destined from the beginning not to be ordinary, but to be extraordinary. This legend lived on in the hearts of the Romans, immortalized in images, statues, and coins, and accompanied the city throughout its history. It was a symbol of faith in a destiny that would elevate Rome above all other cities. In the next chapter, we turn to the royal period, the first rulers of Rome who came to Romulus and laid the foundations on which the Republic and later the Empire were to emerge. Chapter 2. The Royal Age, Rome among the first rulers. After the bloody and mythical foundation by Romulus, an era began for Rome that went down in history as the royal period. It stretched over more than 2 centuries and was shaped by rulers, each of whom laid the foundations for the later greatness of the city in their own way. Although historians today find it difficult to distinguish between myth and reality, the figures of the 7 kings of Rome have become symbols that stand for certain ideas and developments. Among them are warriors and lawgivers, pious priests and ambitious builders, tyrants and fathers of the community. Together, they formed an early Rome that was still small, but already had the energy to become a world power. Romulus, the first king, ruled over the newly founded city after the death of his brother. His most important task was to turn a collection of shepherds and refugees into a community that lasted. In order to fill his city with people, He opened its doors to all who sought welcome. Persecuted, debtors, slaves, adventurers, they all found a new home in Rome. This image of Rome as a place of refuge remained a central motif of Roman identity. But with the growing number of men, a problem arose. There was a lack of women to start families and sustain the city in the long term. Romulus resorted to a drastic solution, which later became known as the rape of the Sabine women. He invited the neighboring Sabines to a feast, and during the spectacle the Romans snatched their daughters and wives from the guests. However, a new community grew out of this brutal act, because the stolen women later prevented the war between their fathers and their new husbands by placing themselves between the fronts and forcing reconciliation. Thus, violence became an association that made Rome stronger. Romulus was followed by Numa Pompilius, a king who was not marked by war, but by wisdom and piety. While Romulus was considered the warrior king, Numa was the lawgiver and priest. He ordered the cult, founded temples, and introduced religious rites that connected Rome with the gods. He was credited with introducing the cult of Vesta, in which virgin priestesses guarded the eternal fire that was never allowed to go out. Numa was considered a wise and just ruler who taught the people to survive not only by force, but also by order and piety. In his time, Rome's religious identity grew, which was to play a central role in all later centuries. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, brought back the martial tradition. He embodied the urge for expansion and fame. The story of his war against Alba Longa, the ancient mother city of Rome, is famous. Instead of having the armies clash in a great battle, it was agreed that 3 brothers from each city would fight against each other, the Horatii for Rome and the Curiati for Alba Longa. 2 Horatii fell, but the third outwitted his opponents and killed them one by one. Rome thus gained supremacy. But Tullus' reign ended tragically. He neglected the gods and sought their favor only late, but his rites failed, and tradition tells that lightning destroyed him and his house. In this way, he became an example of how even warlike greatness could not endure without respect for the gods. Tullus was succeeded by Ancus Marcius, a king who sought a balance between war and peace. He was both warlike and pious, a ruler who conquered new territories but also tried to keep the peace through treaties and rituals. He is credited with the construction of the first prison and the first bridge over the Tiber. Under him, Rome grew beyond its beginnings, and the city gained its first solid structures. Ancus showed that Rome could grow through both violence and order, thus laying a foundation for the pragmatic nature of the Romans. With Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the era of the Etruscan kings began. He came from Etruria, a highly developed culture north of Rome, and brought with him new knowledge, new techniques, and a different idea of rule. Under him, Rome began to become a real city. He managed structures such as the Cloaca Maxima, the large sewage system that existed for centuries, and the Circus Maximus, the arena for chariot races that delighted the people. At the same time, he introduced new symbols of power, which later became an integral part of Roman rule, such as the lictors with their bundles of rods. Tarquinius Priscus made Rome a city that showed greatness not only through myths, but also through visible monuments. He was followed by Servius Tullius, one of the most fascinating kings, who is said to have come from a humble background, perhaps even born a slave. His rule was marked by reforms that changed Rome decisively. He introduced a new order of the people, the so-called centuriate constitution, in which citizens were divided into classes according to their wealth. In doing so, he laid the foundation for the Roman military system and the political organization of the Republic. Under him, the first city walls of Rome were built, the so-called Servian walls, which enclosed and protected the growing Rome. Servius Tullius was thus not only a king, but a designer who laid the foundation on which Rome could grow into a world power. But his reign ended bloodily. His son-in-law Tarquinius Superbus, the last of the kings, seized power by force. Tarquinius Superbus ruled as a tyrant, with severity and without regard for the people. He used forced labor to erect large structures, including the magnificent Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol. But his arrogance and cruelty led to his dismissal. The trigger was the rape of the honorable matron Lucretia by his son Sextus Tarquinius. Lucretia then took her own life, and her fate sparked the wrath of the Romans. They swore never again to tolerate a king above them. Thus ended the royal period and the Republic began, a new epoch that was to lead Rome to unimagined greatness. The royal era was more than a succession of rulers. It was the phase in which Rome learned what it meant to be a community. It gave rise to myths that continue to have an effect until late times. The she-wolf, the twins, the robbery of the Sabine women, the struggle of the Horatii, the piety of Numa, the tyranny of Tarquinius. These stories became symbols that shaped the self-image of the Romans. They saw in their own past not only historical events, but lessons about power, order, justice, and freedom. Thus, the royal period ended with a violent overthrow, but it left behind a legacy that prepared Rome for the future. From the union of war and piety, of architecture and law, of tyranny and resistance, arose the basis for the republic that was to produce the Roman Empire. And so, at the end of this early epoch, there was a realization that Rome was formed not only by divine destiny, but also by the will of the people who had decided to put their own freedom above all else. Chapter 3. The Transition to the Republic. The overthrow of the last king Tarquinius Superbus marked one of the most decisive turning points in the history of Rome. It marked the end of the era of kings who had laid the foundations of the city and the beginning of a new era, the Republic. This transition was not only a political upheaval, but a deep cut in the self-image of the Romans. From now on, Rome was no longer to be ruled by a single ruler, but by institutions based on power sharing, mutual control, and the participation of certain social groups. Even if the Republic was initially anything but democratic in the modern sense, it was a radical break with the past. It was a response to the tyranny suffered by the people under Tarquinius Superbus and an expression of the firm will never again to leave all power to one individual. The trigger for the coup was a personal drama that became a political catastrophe. The story of Lucretia. She was the wife of the distinguished Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, and her virtue was praised by all. But the king's son Sextus Tarquinius desired her and abused his power one night to rape her. Lucretia revealed the crime and then took her own life to preserve her honor. This act shook Rome deeply. Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of the royal family who had been holding back until then, seized the opportunity. He swore on the dagger with which Lucretia had killed herself that never again should a king rule over Rome. His oath moved the citizens, and soon the city rose up against Tarquinius Superbus. The republic that took its place was initially an experiment. It needed new structures to function, and so the Romans created a system that distributed power over several shoulders. The king was replaced by 2 consuls, who were elected annually and shared the supreme power. Each consul could block the decisions of the other, thus introducing the principle of mutual control. This gave rise to what would later be called checks and balances, an idea that would shape political systems thousands of years later. The consuls Brutus and Collatinus, the first officials of the new order, shaped this period. Brutus himself soon became a symbol of the harshness that the Republic demanded. When his own sons became involved in a conspiracy to bring back the king, he had them executed without hesitation. His personal pain became a symbol of the willingness to make sacrifices that every Roman had to make in order to preserve the freedom of the city. But the Republic was not only endangered by external threats, but also by internal tensions. Initially, power was almost exclusively in the hands of the patricians, the long-established noble families. The plebeians, the great mass of the people, had hardly any say. They had to do military service and pay taxes, but their political participation was severely restricted. Early on, this gave rise to a conflict that was to accompany Roman society for centuries: the struggle between patricians and plebeians. In order to secure their position, the Romans introduced a number of offices that were divided into different tasks. In addition to the consuls, there were the praetors, who were responsible for justice, the aediles, who provided markets and games, and the quaestors, who administered the finances. Above all was the idea that no office should be permanent. All power was limited in time, and the principle of collegiality ensured that no one could rule alone. These principles, born out of distrust of the monarchy, became the supporting pillars of the Roman order. However, the Republic was not only a political innovation, but also a military project. Rome was in the midst of hostile tribes: the Etruscans in the north, the Latins and Volscians in the south, the Sabines in the east. Every victory and every defeat shaped the self-confidence of the young republic. The military success was closely related to the new organization. The citizens were now divided into centurions, depending on their wealth, and had to go to war equipped accordingly. Those who had more provided heavier armor and fought in the front ranks, while the poorer citizens fought lightly armed in the rear ranks. This order made Rome flexible and efficient, creating a link between military service and political power. The Republic also marked the beginning of the development of a new understanding of freedom. For the Romans, freedom did not mean individual self-realization, but the freedom of the community from the rule of an individual. This freedom was closely linked to the duty to defend the community. Those who went to war did so not only for personal glory, but also to protect the residential publica, the public cause. This ideal shaped Roman society and made it capable of sticking together for centuries, even in times of greatest crisis. The memory of the tyranny of Tarquinius remained alive and became a warning example for all generations to come. In stories and legends, he became the embodiment of pride and cruelty that would never again be allowed to gain power in Rome. The Romans developed a deep aversion to everything that was reminiscent of royalty. Even centuries later, when emperors ruled the empire, they deliberately avoided the title of king and instead called themselves princeps, the first among equals. So strong was the legacy of the Republic that it changed the language of power forever. The transition to the Republic was thus more than a political change. It was the birth of a system based on mistrust, balance, and duty. Rome had learned that power, when it is in the hands of an individual, leads to tyranny. The answer was a system that limited power and distributed it among many, a system based on the sacrifice of the individual for the community. This spirit gave rise to the Republic that would conquer Italy, defeat Carthage, and finally dominate the Mediterranean in the centuries to come. Society in early Rome was strictly hierarchical. At the top were the patricians, the long-established noble families who traced their ancestry back to the royal period. They saw themselves as bearers of religious and political tradition, guardians of the laws and natural leaders of the people. Initially, all power was in their hands, both in politics and in religion. Only patricians could become consuls or priests, and they provided the members of the Senate, which was the real center of power. Below the patricians stood the great mass of the plebeians, who were Roman citizens but had hardly any political rights. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, or small landowners who cultivated their fields in peacetime and served as soldiers in wartime. Their situation was often difficult, because they bore the brunt of military service and taxes, but had little influence on the decisions of the ruling class. In addition, many plebeians fell into debt bondage if they could not pay their taxes. This system led to them becoming economically dependent on the patricians, and their freedom was threatened. In addition to these two main groups, there were other layers. At the bottom were the slaves, who had no legal status and were completely dependent on their masters. In the early Republic, their number was still comparatively small, as Rome had not yet made the great conquests through which millions of slaves later came into the empire. But even during this time, there were prisoners of war who served as workers and people who had fallen into slavery through debt. Another important group were the clients, free men who placed themselves under the protection of a patrician. They received support and protection, but in return they had to render obedience and service to their patron. This system of patronage permeated Roman society like an invisible net, creating bonds that went beyond purely legal structures. Family life played a central role. The Roman family was strictly patriarchal. At its head was the paterfamilias, the father, who had absolute power over all members of the family. He decided on marriage, property, even life and death of his children. However, this absolute authority was not understood by the Romans as tyranny, but as a necessary order that secured the foundation of society. The woman officially had no political power, but she played an important role in the family. She managed the household, educated the children, and was able to exert great influence through virtue, prestige, and prudence. Famous women such as Lucretia or later Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, became symbols of Roman virtue. Religion permeated everyday life. The Romans saw the influence of the gods in everything that happened. Every action, from plowing the field to concluding a contract, was accompanied by rituals designed to secure the favor of the gods. Sacrifices and prayers were omnipresent, and the priests, mostly patricians, had a key role in society. But religion was less a matter of faith than of action. It was not a matter of having inner convictions, but of performing the rituals correctly. This sober, pragmatic form of piety corresponded to the Roman character and made religion an instrument that ensured order and stability. Im nächsten Kapitel werden wir uns dem ersten großen inneren Konflikt widmen, der das frühe Rom prägte, dem Kampf der Stand, in dem die Plebeje begannen, Rechte gegen die Patrizier durchzusetzen und damit das Fundament für ein breitere politische Ordnung legten. In 494 BC, the so-called First Secessio Plebis, the exodus of the plebeians, took place. When the constant warfare threatened to burden the Republic again, the plebeians refused to take up arms. Instead, they retreated as a whole to the Aventine Hill or the Mons Sacer and declared that they would not return until their situation was improved. This mass protest shook the patricians, for without the plebeians the army was incapable of fighting, and without an army Rome was defenseless. The patricians had to give in and agreed to the introduction of a new office, the tribunes of the people. This law was still harsh and often cruel, but it represented the first step towards a binding legal order that lived not only in the memory of a privileged few. The plebeians continued their struggle with further secessions and protests. They demanded access to the highest offices, to land and to better economic conditions. Over time, they succeeded in implementing significant reforms. They were given the right to appoint consuls, they enforced the right to marry between patricians and plebeians, and finally they succeeded in getting the decisions of the popular assembly, the so-called plebiscita, to have the force of law. This largely eliminated the legal difference between patricians and plebeians. But even though the plebeians formally gained rights, social inequality remained. Many reforms benefited above all the wealthier plebeians, the so-called nobiles, who rose to the Senate and formed a new ruling class together with the patricians. The poorer plebeians, on the other hand, continued to suffer from debts and land shortages. The struggle of the estates thus did not lead to a complete democracy, but rather to a fusion of the upper classes, who shared power, while ordinary people benefited only to a limited extent from the changes. The Battle of the Estates was thus a fundamental chapter in Roman history. It was not a struggle for ideals in the modern sense, but a tough, pragmatic dispute over rights, privileges, and power. But it was precisely in this pragmatism that Rome's strength lay. The Romans were willing to compromise, create institutions, resolve conflicts, and find solutions that held the community together. This spirit made the Republic one of the most stable political orders of antiquity and paved the way for its expansion far beyond Italy. In the next chapter, we will turn to this expansion, the conquest of Italy, in which Rome learned not only to deal with internal tensions, but also to defeat external opponents and integrate them into its community. A particularly stubborn opponent in the north were the Etruscans. Their city of Veii, just a few kilometers from Rome, was a constant rival. The fighting dragged on for decades until Rome finally won a decisive victory in 396 BC under the leadership of the general Marcus Furius Camillus. Veii was conquered and destroyed, its population enslaved or expelled. With this triumph, the power of the Etruscans was broken, and Rome expanded its territory considerably. But no sooner had this victory been achieved than the city was hit by one of the greatest catastrophes in its early history. In 390 BC, a Gallic army under Brennus invaded central Italy and defeated the Romans at the Allia, a tributary of the Tiber. Rome was plundered and burned, and only the castle on the Capitol stood firm. The Gauls only withdrew after receiving a large ransom. The shock of this defeat left a deep mark on the Roman consciousness. From now on, the constant fear of new ideas lived, and at the same time the will arose to fortify the city in such a way that it could never again be surprised in such a way. The construction of the Servian Wall, a powerful fortification, was a direct consequence of this experience. The greatest challenge, however, awaited in the south, where the Samnites ruled. These hill tribes were excellent fighters and defended their independence with tenacious determination. There were 3 wars between Rome and the Samnites, which raged for almost 50 years. The First Samnite War began in 343 BC and ended after a few years with a Roman victory, but it was only the prelude. The Second Samnite War became a decisive test. In a famous episode in 321 BC, the Romans were ambushed in the Cordona passes and had to surrender without a fight. The Roman soldiers were forced to pass under yoke, a humiliating gesture that deeply hurt their honor. But instead of breaking because of it, the Romans vowed to take revenge. The Third Samnite War finally brought the decision. Rome faced not only the Samnites, but also an alliance of their allies, including the Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls. In the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC, the Romans achieved a decisive victory. From then on, the resistance of the Samnites was broken, and Rome was able to extend its power over central Italy. But the south was not yet won. The Greek cities of Italy, the so-called Magna Graecia, watched with concern as Rome pushed further and further south. Especially Taranto, the richest and most powerful of these cities, wanted to preserve its independence. When Rome sent ships into its waters, Taranto attacked and called on King Pyrrhus of Epirus for help. Pyrrhus was an experienced general who came to Italy with war elephants, a terror to the Roman legions who had never seen anything like it. He defeated the Romans in several battles, but his victories were dearly bought. He himself is said to have said, "Another victory like this, and I'm lost." These Pyrrhic victories literally went down in history. Eventually, Pyrrhus had to leave Italy, and Taranto fell to Rome. This conquered the south, and by 272 BC all of Italy was under Roman rule. The way Rome organized its conquests was as important as the victories themselves. Instead of brutally subjugating conquered peoples, Rome created a system of alliances that generated loyalty. Some cities received Roman citizenship, albeit often in a limited form. Others remained formally independent, but had to provide soldiers for Rome. This network made Rome strong because it integrated a multitude of peoples without destroying them completely. It was a system of dependencies and rights that was later applied in the provinces as well. Thus ended the epoch of the Italian conquest with a Rome that was stronger, greater, and more determined than ever before. The Romans had learned to survive setbacks, take advantage of victories, and create a system that stabilized their rule. Italy was the first major stage of their rise, and from here they would soon captivate the entire Mediterranean world. Chapter 7: Rome and the Etruscans. The Etruscans were one of Italy's most fascinating peoples and played a crucial role in Rome's early history. Even before Rome became the dominant power on the peninsula, the Etruscans were a highly developed civilization that deeply influenced the Romans through their culture, religion, art, and technical sophistication. But at the same time, they were dangerous rivals, whose cities repeatedly challenged Rome. The relationship between Rome and the Etruscans was therefore from the beginning one of admiration, influence, and bitter enmity. The path from the small Latin town to the capital of Italy inevitably led Rome through victory against the Etruscan power. The Etruscans lived in the area between the Arno and the Tiber, i.e. in the landscape that was later called Etruria and roughly corresponds to today's Tuscany. Since the 8th century BC, they had founded powerful cities there, which were connected to each other in a loose alliance. Each city was politically independent, but closely connected to the others through language, religion, and culture. Unlike Rome in its early days, the Etruscans knew magnificent temples, impressive city walls, ornate tombs, and a rich upper class that drew its wealth from trade and agriculture. The influence of the Etruscans on Rome was particularly strong in the royal period. Several of the Roman kings, above all Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus, came from Etruscan territory. They brought new religious rituals with them, introduced symbols of power such as the scepter, the purple costume, and the lictors with the fasces, which were later preserved in the Republic and the Empire. Rome also owed a lot to the Etruscans in terms of construction. The construction of the Cloaca Maxima, the large saw, and the construction of monumental temples on the Capitoline Hill bear witness to Etruscan influence. Even the art of chariot racing, which later became mass entertainment in the Circus Maximus, found its way into Rome via the Etruscans. But precisely because the Etruscans were so close, they became enemies after the fall of the Etruscan kingdom in Rome. Rome saw itself as a city of freedom that had freed itself from tyranny, while the Etruscan cities with their powerful kings appeared as a threat. Again and again there were battles between Rome and the Etruscan neighbors. Veii in particular, located only about 20 kilometers north of Rome, became the bitterest rival. Veii was a rich and powerful city that, like Rome, was located on the border between Lazio and Etruria. For decades, both cities waged a grueling war for supremacy in the region. Again and again there were battles, sieges, and peace agreements, but they never lasted long. The rivalry reached its peak in the early 4th century BC, when Rome decided to finally subjugate Veii. The war lasted 10 years, an exceptionally long period for the time. Finally, in 396 BC, under the leadership of the general Marcus Furius Camillus, they succeeded in taking the city. The victory was not only militarily significant, but also symbolic. Rome had destroyed a great Etruscan power and thus considerably strengthened its position in central Italy. But the triumph was short-lived. A few years later, in 390 BC, the Gauls under their leader Brennus invaded Italy and almost completely destroyed Rome. For the Etruscans, this seemed to be an opportunity to regain their old power, but they could no longer hold their ground against Rome. Because the Romans had learned from the catastrophe. They rebuilt their city stronger, erected mighty walls and developed an unwavering determination never to be surprised in such a way again. In the further course of the 4th century, there were renewed battles with the Etruscans. On several occasions, they allied themselves with the Samnites, the Gauls, or other opponents of Rome in order to break the rising power. But the Romans proved to be tough and adaptable. Battles such as that of Sentinum in 295 BC, in which Romans fought against an alliance of Samnites, Gauls, and Etruscans, finally decided the supremacy in Italy. The Romans were victorious, and the power of the Etruscans was irrevocably broken. The subjugation of the Etruscan cities was not the same everywhere. Some were destroyed, others received alliance treaties, and still others lost their independence and were directly integrated into the Roman community. The Romans knew how to act flexibly and to award penalties or privileges depending on the situation. In this way, they secured loyalty and turned their former enemies into allies. But the Etruscans left more than just traces of conflict in Rome. Their culture had a profound impact on Rome. Many religious ideas, such as the art of augurs, i.e. the interpretation of the flight of birds as a divine sign, originated in Etruria. The gladiatorial games, which later became so typical of Rome, also had Etruscan roots, as they originally developed from funeral rituals in which fighters performed in honor of the dead. Even the writing and early forms of Roman architecture bore Etruscan features. The relationship between Rome and the Etruscans was therefore ambivalent. On the one hand, the Romans saw them as the old oppressors and rivals. On the other hand, they had taken over and developed much of them further. Rome was in some ways a legacy of the Etruscan culture, even if it eventually surpassed and displaced it. With the fall of the Etruscan power, an important period in the history of Italy was completed. Rome had shown that it was the determining force not only in Lazio, but in the whole of central Italy. The defeat of the Etruscans opened the way for confrontation with the Samnites, the Gauls, and finally with the Greeks in southern Italy. Each victory expanded not only Rome's territory, but also its self-image as ruler over other peoples. For the Romans, however, the memory of the Etruscans remained alive. Their myths told of kings who had come from Etruria, of enemies who had challenged Rome, and of cultural influences that were deeply rooted in their own everyday lives. Centuries later, Rome still preserved Etruscan rites in its religion, and some of the symbols of power that were visible in the triumphal processions of the emperors had their origins in the ancient culture north of the Tiber. Thus, the history of Rome and the Etruscans was a history of struggle and exchange, of rivalry and cultural fusion. Without the Etruscans, Rome would not have become the Rome that later ruled the world. But by overcoming the Etruscans, Rome showed for the first time the unstoppable energy that made it a power that would radiate far beyond Italy. In the next chapter we turn to the Samnite Wars, which involved Rome in bloody battles with one of the most stubborn opponents of the peninsula and which decisively shaped the character of Roman warfare. Chapter 8. The Samnite Wars. The conflicts with the Samnites are among the toughest and most formative battles in the early history of Rome. For almost 50 years, in 3 great wars, Romans and Samnites faced each other. These battles were more than just regional conflicts. They decided the supremacy of Italy and shaped the military character of Rome, which would later become the basis for expansion beyond the borders of the peninsula. The Samnite Wars were bloody, costly, and full of setbacks, but they showed the unwavering tenacity of the Romans, who drew new strength from defeats and were never willing to admit defeat. The Samnites were a mountain people from the Apennines, whose way of life made them excellent warriors. They were tough, agile, and knew the difficult terrain of the mountains in which they were fighting. Their society was not centrally organized like Rome, but consisted of loose tribal alliances that joined together in times of crisis. It was precisely this independence that made them dangerous opponents. They were not bound by rigid structures, but were able to move quickly, ambush attacks, and retreat into their inaccessible mountains. For the Romans, whose strength lay in discipline and organization, the Samnites were therefore a special challenge. The first conflict thus had no final winner, but it made it clear that the Samnites were not opponents that could be easily defeated. The Second Samnite War, which lasted from 326 to 304 BC, became the decisive touchstone. It began with a dispute over the city of Neapolis, which sought Roman help. Rome took this as an opportunity to penetrate Samnite territory again. But it soon became clear that this war would not be a quick victory. The Samnites used the terrain to their advantage, attacked in the mountains, and repeatedly forced the Romans into difficult situations. The most notorious moment of this war occurred in 321 BC, when the Romans were ambushed in the Cordoni passes. The Samnites had blocked the roads, and the Roman army was completely surrounded. Without the possibility of fighting, the consuls had to surrender. The humiliation that followed was unprecedented. The Roman soldiers were forced to pass under yoke of lances, a symbol of complete submission. This disgrace burned itself deeply into the memory of the Romans. But instead of breaking down because of it, they swore revenge. The oath never to allow such a disgrace to happen again spurred the Republic to new efforts. For years, the Romans continued their attacks, learned to move better in the mountains, and developed new strategies. Eventually, they managed to turn the war in their favor, and in 304 BC, the Samnites made peace. But the conflict did not end there. It was only interrupted. The Third Samnite War, which lasted from 298 to 290 BC, was the hardest and most far-reaching. The Samnites had allied themselves with other peoples, the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and even the Gauls, who kept invading from the north. Rome was thus faced with a formidable alliance that threatened its existence. The decisive battle took place in 295 BC at Sentinum. There, the Roman legions met the combined armies of their enemies. It was one of the largest battles Italy had ever seen. The struggle was fierce and swayed back and forth for a long time. The Samnites fought with unwavering bravery, the Gauls rushed forward wildly, and the Romans were on the verge of defeat. At that moment, the Roman consul Publius Decius Mus is said to have sacrificed his own life. He led a desperate attack directly into the ranks of the enemies to offer his life as a sacrifice to the gods and thereby buy victory for Rome. His death became the turning point of the battle. The Romans took new courage, attacked again, and finally achieved victory. Sentinum was the decisive blow. The alliance fell apart, and the Samnites were broken. Even after Sentinum, the Samnites still resisted, but their strength was exhausted. In 290 BC, they finally submitted to Roman rule. Rome had thus become the undisputed supremacy in central Italy. The defeat of the Samnites once again showed the strength of Roman perseverance. Where other peoples would have lost heart after a heavy defeat, Rome continued to fight, learned from its mistakes, and came back stronger. This pattern was to be repeated throughout Roman history. The Samnite Wars had not only military, but also profound political and social consequences. Rome had to enlarge and professionalize its army. During this time, the Roman legion developed into the powerful unit that would later conquer the world. Instead of the old phalanx, which had been copied from the Greeks, the Romans now increasingly relied on more flexible formations that could be better used in the mountains of Italy. This tactical adaptability became one of the greatest advantages of Roman warfare. Rome's alliance system was also expanded. More and more cities and peoples were integrated into the Roman sphere of influence. Some were given civil rights, others had to provide troops, and still others remained formally independent but were de facto dependent. This created a network of dependencies that secured Rome not only militarily, but also politically. The Samnites were incorporated into this system and later provided soldiers for the Roman legions themselves. Culturally, the Samnite Wars marked a step towards a new identity. Rome was no longer just a city in Lazio, but a power that laid claim to the whole of Italy. The Romans began to see themselves not only as inhabitants of a city, but as leaders of a larger community. The idea that the residential publica controlled the fate of many peoples became stronger. But as much as the Romans asserted their supremacy in Italy after the Samnite Wars, the view to the outside world also opened up. For whoever ruled Italy soon had to face the powers that dominated the Mediterranean. First and foremost was Carthage, the great naval power from North Africa that ruled over Sicily, Spain, and large parts of the Western Mediterranean. The confrontation with Carthage, which was to follow in the Punic Wars, was a direct consequence of the Roman successes in Italy. The Samnites, however, remained in Roman memory despite their defeat. They were considered brave fighters whose resistance Rome had shaped. Their wars had taught the Romans to deal with setbacks, to remain flexible, and never to give up. They had forced Rome to modernize its military organization, and they had shown that Rome ruled not only by force, but also by a skillful system of alliances. At the end of the Samnite Wars there was a new Rome, stronger, more experienced, and with the firm awareness that no opponent was invincible. Italy was largely under Roman control, and the way was clear for the next great period of history: the confrontation with Carthage, which was to make Rome a world power. Chapter 9. The First Punic War. With the subjugation of the Samnites and the securing of the Italian peninsula, Rome had reached a stage that inevitably brought it into conflict with other great powers. Italy alone was not enough, and the Romans turned their gaze to the Mediterranean, where they were soon to meet their most dangerous opponent, Carthage. This powerful trading empire dominated the western Mediterranean world, had a huge fleet and rich colonies in Africa, Spain, Sardinia, and Corsica. The clash between Rome and Carthage was inevitable, and it began with the First Punic War, a conflict that lasted almost a quarter of a century and made Rome a maritime power. The immediate cause was in Sicily. This island has always been a sought-after land, rich in fertile soil and of strategic importance as a bridge between Italy and North Africa. It was here that the interests of Rome and Carthage clashed directly for the first time. In 264 BC, the Romans got into the conflict through a dispute over the city of Messana. The Mamertines, a group of Campania mercenaries, had established themselves there and were threatened by Syracuse. They asked Rome for help, although Carthage traditionally had influence on Sicily. Rome, wishing to secure its newfound position in Italy, decided to intervene, and thus began the first major war between the two powers. At that time, the Romans were mainly land warriors. Their strength lay in the legions, not in seafaring. Carthage, on the other hand, had one of the strongest fleets of the ancient world. Its ships dominated the trade routes and its sailors were experienced fighters at sea. For Rome, this represented a completely new challenge. But the Romans had the ability to create something new out of necessity. Within a few years, they built a fleet that could compete with Carthage's. They were helped by a happy coincidence. A Carthaginian warship was stranded on the Italian coast, and the Romans used it as a template to build their own ships. But they were not satisfied with a mere copy. They invented the corvus, a kind of boarding bridge with a hook that allowed the legionnaires to board enemy ships and turn the battle at sea into a battle on the land, where the Romans were superior. This innovation changed naval battles decisively and suddenly turned inexperienced sailors into dangerous opponents. The fighting in Sicily and at sea dragged on. Rome and Carthage won and lost alternately. One of the largest naval battles took place in 260 BC at Mylae, where the Romans under the consul Gaius Duilius won a surprising victory with the help of corvus. It was the first great maritime spectacle of the Romans and was celebrated with triumphal processions. But they also suffered heavy defeats. Storms destroyed entire fleets, and the cost of war was enormous. It became particularly dramatic when the Romans carried the war directly to Africa. In 256 BC, an army under the consuls Regulus and Manlius landed on African soil and threatened the homeland of Carthage. At first, they achieved great success, but soon the tide turned. Regulus was defeated and captured, and the Roman army suffered heavy losses. The war remained undecided, and both sides had to regroup. The war devoured enormous resources. Entire generations fought on sea and land, and the number of deaths was frighteningly high. But the Romans did not give up. Again and again they built new fleets, even when storms destroyed them. Carthage fought just as fiercely, but its strength lay in its defensive and naval supremacy, while Rome relied on the offensive and the indomitable energy of its citizens. The Barcides, led by Hamilcar Barcas, saw Spain as an opportunity to strengthen Carthage and one day challenge Rome. Hamilcar himself was a bitter opponent of Rome, who, after losing the War of Sicily, swore never to make peace with Rome. He began to build his own empire in Spain and eventually passed this legacy on to his son Hannibal, one of the greatest generals in history. Hannibal was sworn to Rome from childhood. Legend has it that Hamilcar made his son swear at the altar to hate Rome forever. This oath was to seal the fate of both powers. In 218 BC, Hannibal set out from Spain with an army. He led about 50,000 soldiers, including his notorious war elephants, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul and finally across the Alps to Italy. The Alpine crossing was a masterpiece of military logistics and at the same time a hellish march. Icy cold, snowstorms, attacks by hostile tribes, and the inhospitable nature of the mountains demanded a high price. Many of his soldiers died, as did numerous elephants. But Hannibal managed the impossible. He reached Italy with an army ready for battle and took the Romans completely by surprise. From then on, a series of battles began that made Hannibal one of Rome's greatest opponents. Right at the beginning, on the Ticinus and the Trebia, he defeated Roman armies by superior tactics. He was a master at exploiting the arrogance and impatience of the Romans. In 217 BC, he ambushed the consul Gaius Flaminius on Lake Trasimeno. His army lured the Romans into a narrow valley, and as they marched in, Hannibal attacked from all sides. The Roman army was almost completely destroyed, and Flaminius fell in battle. Panic gripped Rome, because never before had an opponent won so deeply in Italy. Rome was on the brink of the abyss. Many of his allies in Italy began to switch sides. Cities in southern Italy, including Capua, opened their gates to Hannibal. But despite all the victories, Hannibal did not succeed in taking Rome himself. The city, protected by its walls and by the determination of its citizens, remained unshakable. Instead of giving up, the Romans reacted with iron discipline. They decided not to dare any more decisive battles against Hannibal, but to weaken him through attrition. This new course was named after Fabius Maximus, the cunctator, the procrastinator who, through delay and constant small attacks, kept Hannibal in Italy without giving him the opportunity to achieve a final victory. While Hannibal devastated Italy, Rome attacked on other fronts. In Spain, the brothers Publius and Gnaeus Scipio fought against the Carthaginian power base, and after their deaths a young general appeared who was to change fate, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus. He took command in Spain and decisively defeated the Carthaginians. In doing so, he cut off Hannibal from his most important sources of supply. Finally, Rome dared to strike the decisive blow. Scipio Africanus brought the war to Africa, right at the gates of Carthage. Hannibal, who was still in Italy, was recalled to defend his homeland. In 202 BC, the decisive battle took place at Zama. Hannibal and Scipio stood opposite each other, two of the greatest generals of antiquity. This time Rome had the better cards. The Roman cavalry, supported by Numidian allies, broke the Carthaginian flanks, and Hannibal's army was defeated. The war was decided. The Second Punic War left deep marks. Rome had become a great power, its authority in Italy was unchallenged, and it had proved its ability to wage war not only on land but also at sea and in distant lands. But the casualties were enormous. Hundreds of thousands had fallen, large parts of Italy were devastated, and Rome's society was permanently changed. The gap between rich and poor grew, and many peasants who had lost their fields crowded into the city. This was later to lead to serious social conflicts. Despite these internal tensions, the victory over Hannibal was a turning point. Rome was no longer a regional power, but an emerging world power that would soon become active in the East. The war had shown that no catastrophe, no matter how great, could break Rome. This experience shaped the self-image of the Romans for all time. Chapter 11: Rome in Greece and the East. After the victory over Hannibal, Rome stood as the undisputed power in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage was humiliated, its fleet destroyed, its possessions in Spain lost. But while in the West the rivalry with the old opponent subsided, a new field of conflict opened up in the East. Greece, the land of philosophers, poets, and warriors, has been the cultural center of the Mediterranean world for centuries. But politically it was torn. The once powerful city-states of Athens and Sparta had their heyday behind them, and new forces such as Macedonia or the Seleucids determined their fate. Rome now advanced into this world, first as an ally, then as a judge, and finally as ruler. Rome's first contact with Greece happened almost by chance. During the Second Punic War, Philip V of Macedon had formed an alliance with Hannibal to share the victory over Rome. But Hannibal's defeat ruined this plan, and Rome saw a new opponent in Philip. The First Macedonian War, 214 to 205 BC, did not take place without much decision, but it brought Rome into the affairs of Greece. Rome sided with various Greek cities and learned that Greece's complicated alliance systems could be as dangerous as they were useful. The real breakthrough came with the Second Macedonian War, 200 to 196 BC. This time, Rome acted as the liberator of Greece. Under the general Titus Quinctius Flamininus, the Romans decisively defeated Philip V at Cynocephalae in Thessaly. The Roman legion, flexible and agile, proved superior to the Macedonian phalanx. In a famous gesture, Flamininus proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games. The crowd rejoiced, and Rome presented itself as protector, not conqueror. But this freedom was deceptive. Although the cities were allowed to retain their autonomy, Rome was henceforth the arbiter who decided their disputes and asserted its interests. The next great challenge came from Antiochus III, the king of the Seleucids. He ruled over a vast empire stretching from Asia Minor to Persia, and saw in Greece an opportunity to expand his influence. But Rome opposed him. In the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, the Roman general Lucius Cornelius Scipio, the brother of the famous Scipio Africanus, was victorious, and Antiochus had to accept the peace of Apamea. He lost Asia Minor, had to pay high tributes, and was no longer allowed to maintain large war fleets. With this, Seleucid power was broken, and Rome had extended its influence far into the east. Meanwhile, Macedonia remained a constant source of unrest. After Philip's death, his son Perseus took over the reign and tried to restore the old power. But Rome did not allow this. The Third Macedonian War, 171 to 168 BC, ended with the Battle of Pydna, in which the Roman general Lucius Aemilius Paulus defeated the Macedonian phalanx. The victory was not only decisive militarily, but also symbolically. It finally showed the superiority of the Roman legion over the Greek phalanx, which had been considered invincible for centuries. Macedonia was dethroned and divided into 4 dependent republics controlled by Rome. Rome thus appeared more and more openly as a ruler in the East. At first, they pretended to liberate the Greeks and preserve their autonomy. But the reality was different. Roman envoys intervened more and more frequently in the internal affairs of the cities, deciding on alliances, punishments, and privileges. Those who resisted got to know the harshness of the new power. A cruel example of this was the destruction of Corinth in 146 BC. The city, once a center of trade and culture, had rebelled against Rome. The Romans plundered them, killed or enslaved the inhabitants, and had their walls torn down. The same year also saw the final destruction of Carthage, a double symbol of the fact that Rome had now achieved undisputed dominion in both the West and the East. However, the encounter with Greece had not only political and military consequences, but also profound cultural effects. The Romans admired Greek art, philosophy, and literature. They began to bring Greek teachers and artists to Rome, to merge Greek gods with their own, and to appropriate the ideas of Greek thinkers. The Roman upper class sent their sons to Athens or Rhodes to study rhetoric and philosophy. Soon it was considered a sign of education to speak Greek and quote Homer or Plato. But this cultural opening also led to tensions. Some Romans, such as ancient Cato the Elder, warned that the Greek way of life could spoil Roman harshness and simplicity. He feared that luxury, philosophy, and excessive education would weaken the virtues that had made Rome great: discipline, piety, and military toughness. Nevertheless, the penetration of Greek culture was unstoppable. Rome conquered Greece politically, but spiritually Greece conquered Rome. The expansion into the East brought Rome not only glamour, but also new problems. The huge raids and tributes poured into Rome and enriched the upper class enormously. At the same time, the simple peasants in Italy came under increasing pressure. Many had lost their fields in the long wars and moved to the city, where they lived on bread distribution and casual work. While the rich built estates, so-called latifundia, and farmed them with slaves, the number of dispossessed people in Rome grew. These social tensions were soon to lead to internal crises. In the East, however, Roman rule was secured. Greece, Macedonia, and Asia Minor were under Roman influence, and no power could seriously endanger Rome there. The Seleucids fell into disrepair, the Ptolemies in Egypt still held, but they too became increasingly dependent on Roman politics. Rome had thus become not only a power of the West, but also of the East. The victory over Greece and the expansion into Asia Minor showed a new dimension of Roman politics. It was no longer just about the survival or security of Italy, but about domination over entire regions that were far away from home. Rome had become an empire, even if it did not yet know this concept in full clarity. But the further Rome expanded, the stronger the internal tensions became. The question of how to administer the new territories, how to distribute the riches, and how to deal with the growing number of poor posed tasks for the Republic that eventually began to overwhelm it. Thus, the conquest of Greece was not only a triumph, but also a turning point. Rome had conquered the old cultural world and at the same time appropriated it. It was stronger and richer than ever, but inside it began to ferment. The coming decades were to show that the greatest danger no longer came from outside, but from within its own ranks. Chapter 12. The Third Punic War and the Fall of Carthage. After Rome had subjugated Greece and Macedonia in the east, the Republic's gaze turned again to the west, to where the old archenemy Carthage still existed. Although Carthage was severely weakened after the Second Punic War and was no longer allowed to maintain a large fleet, the city recovered surprisingly quickly. Through trade, agriculture, and skillful administration, it regained economic strength. It was precisely this recovery that aroused suspicion in Rome. Many Romans saw Carthage not only as a defeated opponent, but as a constant threat that could one day once again endanger their freedom. One person in particular warned tirelessly: Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder. This strict, tradition-conscious Roman feared that Carthage could regain strength. His statement became famous, which he added at the end of every speech, no matter what the topic: Ceterum censeo Carthaginem est delendam. By the way, I am of the opinion that Carthage must be destroyed. This demand became a symbol of an attitude that found more and more supporters in Rome. Finally, the conviction prevailed that the conflict with Carthage could not be ended by treaties, but only by its complete destruction. The reason for the Third Punic War arose from the tensions between Carthage and Numidia, a North African empire under King Massinissa, which was allied with Rome. Massinissa took every opportunity to harass Carthage, attacked its territories and humiliated the city, knowing full well that Carthage could not defend itself without Rome's consent. When the Carthaginians finally took up arms and fought against Numidia, Rome declared this a breach of the peace treaty. For the Roman leadership, it was the pretext they had been waiting for. The war began in 149 BC. Roman armies landed in Africa and besieged Carthage. But the city fought back desperately. The Carthaginians, who had once shaken the world under Hannibal, now showed their determination once again. They built weapons, even melted down gold and jewelry to extract metal for armor, and defended themselves in fierce street fighting. The war became a siege battle that lasted 3 years. The Romans soon realized that only total destruction would lead to the goal. Under the leadership of Scipio Aemilianus, a grandson of the famous Scipio Africanus, they intensified the siege. Finally, they managed to break through the walls and enter the city. What followed was an inferno. House after house, street after street was conquered. Women and children fought alongside the men, and the city turned into a battlefield that sank into blood and fire. In 146 BC, Carthage finally fell. Hundreds of thousands were killed or sold into slavery. The city was systematically destroyed, its buildings burned down, its walls torn down. Later, it was said that the Romans had sprinkled salt over the rubble to ensure that nothing could ever grow there again, a rather symbolic myth, but an expression of final annihilation. On the site of the once so proud metropolis, only a desert of ruins remained. With the destruction of Carthage, the old archenemy was wiped out. Rome had not only won the war, but had ended the rivalry forever. Africa became a Roman province, and the western Mediterranean was now completely under Roman control. No state could challenge the power of Rome in this region anymore. But the destruction of Carthage was more than a military victory. It was a sign of how much Rome had changed. The Republic, which had once fought for its freedom against kings, had now become an unstoppable conquering power itself, tolerating no rivals. The call for Carthago delenda ist had been heard, but it also showed that Rome's politics were increasingly determined by fear, the desire for power and the will for total domination. In the same year that Carthage fell, the Romans also destroyed Corinth in Greece. The message was clear: anyone who opposed Rome could expect complete annihilation. This marked the beginning of a new era in which Rome was no longer just one state among many, but the undisputed hegemonic power of the Mediterranean. The consequences for Rome itself were profound. With the destruction of Carthage and the expansion in the east, enormous riches poured into the city. Raids, tributes and slaves changed society. The upper class became richer and more powerful, while many peasants who had lost their fields in the war became impoverished. The latifundia, large estates owned by a few spread and were farmed with slaves. At the same time, the number of dispossessed people who crowded into Rome and were dependent on supplies there grew. These social tensions were soon to lead to the first major internal crises. For the Romans, however, the victory was initially a reason for pride. They had finally defeated the old enemy. They had become the mistress of the West. The name of Hannibal, which had once spread terror, was now only a memory, and Carthage was extinguished. But the price was high, a republic that had become rich through victories, but also restless. In retrospect, the destruction of Carthage was often seen as a turning point. Rome had shown that it was ready not only to defeat opponents, but to wipe them out completely. This principle would later affect other peoples if they resisted Roman power. The spirit of compromise that had characterized the struggle of the estates in the early republic was hardly noticeable on the international stage. The law of strength now prevailed there, which tolerated no rivalry. After the triumphs in the West and East, Rome was at the height of its power. Carthage had been destroyed, Greece and Macedonia had been subjugated, and new provinces had been created in Asia Minor and Africa. Rome had become the undisputed supremacy in the Mediterranean. But this expansion brought not only wealth and fame, but also tensions and problems that began to destroy the republic from within. What seemed like an unstoppable success story on the outside was marked by crises, inequality, and growing instability on the inside. The conquests changed the structure of Roman society so profoundly that the old order began to falter. At first, the influx of riches was enormous. Whole shiploads full of gold, silver, works of art and slaves poured into Rome. Generals returned in triumph, their chariots loaded with booty, their names celebrated by the population. But prosperity was unevenly distributed. The greatest benefit was enjoyed by the senators and wealthy nobles, who greatly increased their power through spoils of war, new provincial taxes, and control of trade routes. Many of them acquired huge estates, the so-called latifundia, which they farmed with countless slaves. Rome's society began to change dramatically as a result. On the one hand, there was a small, extremely rich upper class that ruled over land, wealth, and political office. On the other hand, the number of poor people who depended on the goodwill of the powerful grew. Between these extremes disappeared the old stratum of independent peasants, which had long been the foundation of the republic. With their decline also began the decline of the old republican virtues: toughness, simplicity, a sense of duty and sacrifice. Instead, luxury, ambition and corruption gained more and more influence. The expansion also led to political problems. Rome had to administer new provinces that were far away and whose population was not Roman. For this purpose, governors were appointed, usually senators, who were sent to the provinces for a year or more. But these men often used their office to enrich themselves personally. They squeezed the population, demanded excessive taxes, and shamelessly exploited their power. Although there were occasional trials against particularly corrupt governors, they usually went unpunished. This led to growing hatred of Rome among the provincial inhabitants and to a call for reforms that initially went unheard. Another problem was the increasing competition within the ruling class. In the past, consuls and senators had the common good in mind, at least in theory. Now, however, the competition for offices, honors, and wealth became increasingly fierce. Those who commanded an army and achieved victories could win not only fame, but also enormous riches. As a result, the urge for military command grew ever greater, and the rivalry between ambitious generals began to threaten the stability of the republic. It was in this situation that the first serious attempts at reform occurred. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who tried to stop social decline in the 2nd century BC, became particularly famous. Tiberius Gracchus proposed to redistribute the state land, which had been illegally used by rich senators, in order to give land back to the dispossessed. His proposal met with fierce resistance from the upper class, but he won the support of the People's Assembly. The conflict ended tragically. Tiberius was beaten to death by supporters of the upper class in 133 BC, the first time that political violence broke out in this form in Rome. 10 years later, his brother Gaius tried to continue the reforms. He expanded it to include measures such as subsidizing grain and establishing colonies for poor citizens. But he also met with fierce resistance. Eventually, riots broke out, and Gaius met his death when his followers were crushed by the troops of the Senate. The Gracchi began a new era in which political conflicts were increasingly carried out with violence. The old consensus that had held the Republic together for a long time had been broken. The crisis of the Republic was also reflected in numerous slave revolts. The influx of millions of slaves led to a society based on oppression, and again the oppressed rose up against their masters. The revolt in Sicily in 135 to 132 BC was particularly notorious, when tens of thousands of slaves fought against Rome before they were defeated. These uprisings shook the Republic and showed how fragile the social order had become. So expansion was combined with crisis. The outer splendor could not conceal the inner cracks. The upper class was divided between conservative senators, who clung to the old order, and reformers, who demanded change. The masses of the people became more and more a plaything of politics, while the peasantry, once the heart of the Republic, continued to disappear. At the same time, the power of individual generals grew, who no longer regarded their armies only as tools of the state, but as a personal power base. The victory over Carthage and Greece had made Rome a great power, but it had also sown the seeds of destruction. The following decades were to show that the greatest dangers no longer came from external enemies such as Hannibal or Philip of Macedon, but from Rome itself. The struggle for wealth, power, and reforms would plunge the Republic into a maelstrom of violence and civil wars, from which in the end not the old Republic but a new, monarchical system would emerge. His main concern was agrarian reform. Over decades, more and more state land, which was supposed to belong to all citizens, had been taken over by rich senators and nobles. They used it for their latifundia and had it farmed by slaves, while the simple farmers were increasingly displaced. Tiberius wanted to regain this land and redistribute it in order to give the dispossessed an economic basis again and to strengthen the old peasant middle class. His proposal was by no means revolutionary, but invoked old laws that had never been consistently enforced. But the upper class saw this as a direct attack on their power and privileges. But the spark that Tiberius had lit did not go out. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius Sempronius Gracchus appeared on stage. Gaius was of a different nature from Tiberius, a passionate, brilliant orator, more politically skilled. In 123 BC he was elected tribune of the people and was resolutely committed to continuing and expanding his brother's ideas. But his reforms went much further. Gaius Gracchus realized that the problem was not only in the distribution of land, but went deeper. He introduced measures that were intended to help the poor directly, for example through state-subsidized grain that was supposed to ensure the supply of the urban population. He also suggested colonies where the dispossessed could be settled, including one in Carthage, which had only recently been destroyed. In doing so, he wanted to diffuse social tensions and create new opportunities for poor citizens. Gaius' attempt to curtail the power of the Senate was particularly controversial. He transferred control of the courts, which had previously been dominated by senators, to the knightly class, i.e. the wealthy merchants and entrepreneurs. In doing so, he created a counterweight to the senatorial aristocracy and gained new allies. But this step divided the political elite even more. At first, Gaius seemed successful. He was elected tribune of the people for a second time, and his reforms received widespread support. But soon resistance arose. His opponents exploited the fears of the population, especially against the plans to grant civil rights to their allies. In a heated atmosphere, riots broke out, which finally ended in open violence. The Senate resorted to a drastic measure. For the first time, it issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a kind of emergency decree that gave the consuls unlimited power to save the Republic. The consuls cracked down on Gaius and his followers. Bloody fighting broke out in the streets of Rome. Gaius, pursued by the troops of the Senate, finally committed suicide to avoid falling into the hands of his enemies. Thousands of his followers were killed or executed. Thus, the second attempt of the Gracchi had also failed. But their ideas and their fate had irrevocably changed the Republic. For the first time, it had become clear that Rome's social problems could not be solved by small corrections, but only by far-reaching reforms. For the first time, we had seen that political conflicts were no longer decided by compromise, but by violence. The murders of the Gracchi were the signal that the old order had become fragile and that in the future the struggle for power would become increasingly fierce. The Gracchus brothers were later considered by many to be martyrs who had died for justice and the rights of the poor. Others saw them as dangerous demagogues who had destabilized the republic. In truth, they were both idealists who drew attention to grievances, and at the same time harbingers of a new epoch in which political power was no longer in the hands of the old aristocracy alone, but was fought out in a constant struggle between tribunes of the people, the Senate, and military commanders. The death of the Gracchi marked the beginning of a period in which the republic was increasingly torn apart by internal conflicts. The seeds of violence had been sown, and the decades to come would show that Rome had taken the path to civil wars. Chapter 15. Marius and the Army Reform. After the bloody end of the Gracchi and the failure of their reforms, the Roman Republic had not come to rest. Social tensions remained, the contradictions between rich and poor grew, and the political culture was permanently marked by violence. In this troubled time, a man appeared on the scene who was to fundamentally change Roman politics and the military: Gaius Marius. He did not come from the venerable upper class, but was a homo novus, a new man who dared to rise without an aristocratic line of ancestors. He began a development that shook the foundations of the Republic and opened the way to an era of power struggles and civil wars. Marius was born around 157 BC in Arpinum, a city in Lazio that would later also produce Cicero. His origins were modest. He came from a family without a senatorial tradition. But he showed early military talent and worked his way up through discipline and ambition. His breakthrough came in the Jugurthine War, a conflict in North Africa that occupied Rome for years. Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, led a tenacious resistance against Rome and was a master at weakening Roman commanders through bribery and deception. Marius served under the general Quintus Caecilius Metellus, but he soon became a rival of his superior. With the support of the People's Assembly, Marius was given the supreme command and achieved fame when Jugurtha finally fell into Roman hands through treachery. The success in Africa made Marius popular, but the real test followed a little later. In the north, Germanic tribes threatened the empire. The Cimbri and Teutons, wandering peoples, had been set in motion and inflicted devastating defeats on the Romans. Entire legions were wiped out, and there were fears in Rome that the city could be overrun a second time by the Gauls of 390 BC, as it had once been. In this emergency, they turned to Marius, who was elected consul several times in a row, a break with tradition, which actually prohibited such re-election. But the Republic needed a savior. Marius recognized that the Roman army had to be fundamentally reformed. Until now, the military had been based on the peasant class, who served as citizens with their own land and returned to their fields after military service. But as more and more farmers were impoverished and had lost their land, the number of those fit for military service shrank. Marius broke through this old system. He opened up military service to the dispossessed, the so-called captivates, men who had nothing but their heads. The state provided them with weapons and equipment, and service in the legion became the basis of their livelihood. This reform had far-reaching consequences. For the first time, every citizen could become a soldier, regardless of property. The legions were filled with men who had lived in poverty and were now dependent on booty, pay, and the care of their general. At the same time, the legions became more professional. Marius introduced standardized equipment, improved training, and turned the Roman army into a powerful professional army. The soldiers became known as the mules of Marius because they carried all their luggage themselves and were therefore more mobile and independent. With this new army, Marius marched against the Germanic threats. First, he defeated the Teutons in southern Gaul in 102 BC, then the Cimbri in northern Italy at Vercelli in 101 BC. These victories made him the celebrated savior of Rome. The Germanic danger was averted, and Marius was considered the greatest general of his time. But his reforms had created a new problem. The soldiers' loyalty was now less to the state than to their general, who promised them land, booty, and recognition. This was the seed of the development that would later lead to the emergence of personal armies and the dissolution of the republican order. Marius himself used his fame to assert himself politically. But he was not a skillful strategist in the intrigues of the Senate. His enmity with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a younger, ambitious general from the aristocratic upper class, was soon to become one of the most bitter rivalries in the Republic. At first, the two had worked together in the Jugurthine War, but their competition for fame and influence turned them into mortal enemies. Tensions escalated when the war against Mithridates, the king of Pontus, broke out. This empire in Eastern Asia Minor threatened Roman interests, and the question of who should take command in this important war divided the Republic. Sulla had originally been appointed by the Senate, but Marius tried to seize command through a political maneuver. Sulla, however, refused to give the order and took an unprecedented step. He marched with his legions on Rome itself. In doing so, he broke a taboo that had previously been unimaginable in Roman politics. For the first time, a general and his troops attacked his own city. Sulla forced Marius to flee, but Marius soon returned when Sulla left for the east. In a bloody civil war, Marius and his followers once again seized power in Rome. A time of terror followed, in which his opponents were persecuted and killed. But Marius was old and sick. He died shortly after his 7th consulship in 86 BC, and the power struggles continued without him. Marius' army reforms were a turning point in many respects. They made Rome militarily stronger and made possible victories that would not have been possible otherwise. But they also changed the foundations of the Republic. The army was no longer a tool of the state, but became an instrument of power for individual generals. The soldiers saw their commander as the real guarantor of their survival and future. This new relationship between army and politics led to men such as Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, or later Augustus using their legions to gain personal power in the following decades. Marius himself remained an ambivalent figure. For many Romans, he was the savior who had fended off the Germanic threat. For others, he was a demagogue whose ambition and violence plunged the Republic into chaos. What is certain is that he had opened the doors through which others would later walk. He marked the beginning of the time of the generals who decided the fate of Rome, a time when the sword weighed more than the laws of the Republic. So the rise of Marius was both an ascent and a downfall. He led Rome to great victories and created an army that was to become the basis of the imperial power state. But he also sowed the seeds of civil wars that would tear the Republic apart. After him, Rome could no longer return to the old order. The path had been taken that finally led to the end of the Republic and the birth of the Principate. Chapter 16. Sulla and the Civil War. After the death of Marius, the Roman Republic had not come to rest. The rivalry between Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla had already left deep marks, and with the end of the old general, Sulla began to leave his own bloody trail in the history of Rome. He was the first Roman to occupy Rome with an army, the first to systematically publish lists of his political opponents and have them killed, and at the same time a man who tried to preserve the old order by providing it with new foundations by brute force. His life and work embody the contradiction of the late Republic, the urge for personal power and at the same time the appeal to save the Republican tradition. Lucius Cornelius Sulla came from an old, albeit impoverished, noble family. Born in 138 BC, he did not grow up in the splendor of wealth, but learned early on to get by. But his ambition and talent led him into politics and especially into the military. He first served under Marius in the Juguthinian War and gained fame when he succeeded in capturing Jugurtha by ruse. Even then, the rivalry between the two men began, which would eventually determine the fate of Rome. However, his real career began with the war against Mithridates VI, the king of Pontus. This ambitious ruler had sparked a revolt against Rome in Asia Minor and had tens of thousands of Roman and Italian traders and settlers murdered, a bloodbath that went down in history as the Vespers of Ephesus. This was a tremendous affront to Rome, and the Senate decided to wage war. The command was initially given to Sulla, who had already been consul at that time. But in Rome, the followers of the late Marius stirred. They succeeded in having the command subsequently transferred to Marius, even though he was old and ill. For Sulla, this was an unbearable humiliation. For the first time in the history of the Republic, a general took a step that shook the foundations of the state. He marched on Rome with his legions. The city, which had been safe from the weapons of its own citizens for centuries, became a battlefield. Sulla drove out the supporters of Marius, prevailed and had the command of the war reconfirmed. While Sulla moved east to fight Mithridates, the Marians rose again. Under the leadership of Cinna and later Gaius Marius the Younger, the adopted son of the old general, they attacked Rome and gained power. A reign of terror began, in which Sulla's followers were persecuted and killed. When Sulla returned after years of war against Mithridates, he was once again faced with a divided city. But this time he came back with a victorious army, experienced and loyal. In 83 BC, the civil war between the Sullans and the Marians began. It was a struggle of relentless cruelty that shook all Italy. Sulla won the decisive battles and marched on Rome a second time. Now the real reign of terror began, which was to forever associate his name with blood and terror. Sulla introduced the so-called proscriptions, public lists of enemies of the state, whom anyone could kill. Those who were on these lists lost their lives and their assets, which were distributed to Sulla's followers. Entire families were wiped out, opponents persecuted, riches confiscated. The number of victims was in the thousands, and a climate of fear settled over Rome. For Sulla, this was a necessary means to secure his rule and to eliminate the opponents once and for all. For the Republic, however, it was a step that irrevocably destroyed political culture. Violence had now become a legitimate means of politics, and no citizen could feel safe anymore. But Sulla was not only a tyrant. He saw himself as a restorer of the Republic. After eliminating his opponents, he had himself appointed dictator, not for a limited time like previous dictators, but for an indefinite period of time. In this office, he carried out a series of reforms aimed at strengthening the power of the Senate and weakening the role of the tribunes of the people. The tribunes, who had become powerful representatives of the masses of the people since the Gracchi, were no longer allowed to seek further office, and their powers were severely restricted. The Senate, on the other hand, was enlarged and its authority over the courts and the provinces was strengthened. Sulla believed that by these measures he could restore the old order, in which the Senate was a center of power and ambitious individuals could not push their way to the top through the people. But in reality, he himself undermined this order by showing that a general could achieve anything with an army, including the dictatorship over Rome. His reforms were an attempt to turn back the clock, but they were at odds with his own rise to power. It is noteworthy that after consolidating his power and carrying out his reforms, Sulla voluntarily resigned. In 79 BC he resigned from the dictatorship and retired to his country house, where he died a short time later. This gesture was unique. A man who had had absolute power gave it up voluntarily. But his reforms did not survive him for long, and his example of the armed march on Rome remained. Future generals such as Pompey, Caesar, and later Augustus would go down this path without ever thinking of resigning voluntarily. Chapter 17. Pompey, Crassus, and the Rise of Caesar. After Sulla's death, Rome did not enter a phase of calm, but plunged from one constellation of power to the next. The structures that Sulla had left behind were fragile, his reforms controversial, and the society of the Republic continued to be marked by tensions, rivalries, and the urge of individual men for power. In this environment, three figures emerged who were to determine the fate of Rome for the decades to come: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Together, they later formed the famous First Triumvirate, an alliance that effectively transformed the Republic into a rule of three men. But their paths crossed not out of friendship, but out of mutual benefit, and their rivalries eventually led to new civil wars. Pompey, who was nicknamed Magnus, the Great, during his lifetime, was the most brilliant general of his time. He came from a wealthy family and distinguished himself early on through military success. At a young age, he led his own troops in the service of Sulla and was entrusted with high commands despite the lack of official offices. His victories against the Marians in Africa and Spain made him famous. In Rome, he was considered a man favored by Fortuna, and he was celebrated by the people like a hero. Crassus, on the other hand, was of a completely different nature. He was not a brilliant general, but the richest man in Rome. He had partly inherited his fortune, partly increased it through clever business, speculation, and not infrequently unscrupulous methods. He bought up land from convicts, had houses bought cheaply after fires, and profited from the misery of others. But despite his wealth, he lacked the fame that military successes brought. In order to gain recognition, he was looking for a field in which he could make a name for himself. This opportunity presented itself to him when the famous slave revolt under Spartacus broke out in 73 BC. Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, led a huge army of slaves that terrified Rome for years. Several legions were defeated by the rebels, and the reputation of the Republic suffered severely. Finally, Crassus was given command. With iron discipline, he restored order, defeated Spartacus in a bloody battle, and crucified thousands of captive slaves along the Appian Way, setting a cautionary tale. But the glory of the final victory was partly taken away from him, as Pompey, who returned from Spain with his army, destroyed the remnants of the slave army and was celebrated as a co-conqueror. A rivalry began between the two men that never completely disappeared. While Pompey and Crassus expanded their power through military and economic successes, a third came to the fore, Julius Caesar. He came from an old but impoverished patrician family and combined aristocratic origin with the instinct of a man of the people. Caesar was ambitious, brilliant in his rhetoric, and knew how to win the favor of the people. Early on, he sided with the populace, the political direction that emphasized the people and the popular assembly against the Senate. Through cleverly arranged marriages, alliances, and generous games and celebrations, he won sympathy. But to achieve his ambitious goals, he needed the support of powerful allies. While Caesar was waging war in Gaul, he won victories that increased his popularity immeasurably. For 8 years, he fought against tribes that had previously been foreign to the Romans. He penetrated as far as the North Sea, crossed the Rhine, even dared 2 expeditions to Britain. His reports, which he wrote down in the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, made him a folk hero in Rome. At the same time, he built an army that was personally loyal to him, a power base that set him apart from his rivals. Now Pompey and Caesar stood directly opposite each other. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, moved closer to the Senate, which saw in him the counterweight to Caesar's growing power. When Caesar's term in Gaul expired, the Senate demanded that he lay down his legions and return to Rome. Caesar, however, knew that if he returned without his army, he would be tried in Rome. The conflict came to a head, and in 49 BC the decision was made. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the border river with Italy, and spoke the famous words, "Alia iactarist," the die is cast. This step marked the beginning of a new civil war. Pompey fled to Greece, while Caesar took Rome without resistance. In the following years, decisive battles took place, including 48 BC at Pharsalos, where Caesar defeated Pompey. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the orders of the young king Ptolemy XIII. Thus, the former hero of Rome had become a victim of the intrigues, and Caesar stood there as the undisputed victor. The development from Sulla's dictatorship to the triumvirate to Caesar's rise shows how much the Republic had entered a new epoch. Power was no longer in the institutions, but in the hands of individual men who used their armies, money, and popularity to dominate the state. The Senate was a shadow of its former self, unable to control events. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar were the embodiment of this change. Crassus stood for the influence of money, Pompey for the splendor of military glory, Caesar for the combination of popular favor and military power. Together, they had divided the Republic among themselves, but in the end it was Caesar who surpassed them all and took the fate of Rome into his own hands. When Gaius Julius Caesar took command of Gaul in 58 BC, hardly anyone suspected that he would lay the foundation for his rise to autocracy. At that time, Gaul was not a unified empire, but a patchwork of tribes and alliances, often hostile to each other, but in their entirety a vast and rich area that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic and from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. Gaul was of strategic importance to Rome, because it lay like a buffer between Italy and the Germanic peoples who repeatedly pushed across the Rhine. Caesar cleverly exploited this situation. In the following years, he led campaigns against numerous Gallic tribes, subjugated the Belgians in the north, fought against the Venetians on the Atlantic coast and secured supremacy over large parts of the country. In doing so, he relied not only on military strength, but also on diplomacy. Some tribes he won through alliances and promises, others he defeated with brutal severity. Again and again he sold his wars in Rome as a necessary defense, while in reality he conquered a huge territory step by step. His victories were not only military, but also political. With his reports from Gaul, which he wrote in clear, sober language, he spoke directly to the Roman people. These commentarii were not only a chronicle, but also a clever propaganda tool. They portrayed Caesar as a brave, superior general and made his opponents in the Senate appear old and hesitant. As he gained fame and popularity, fear grew in Rome that he would one day use his army to march against the Republic itself. Gaul, however, remained forever part of the Roman Empire, and Caesar's conquest shaped the history of Europe. A land of Celtic tribes became the heart of the empire, where Roman culture and language later took root that have left traces to this day. For the Romans, Gaul was a land of conquest and glory. For Caesar, it was the key to power, and for the Republic, it was the beginning of the end. With his murder, the conspirators hoped to save the Republic. They believed that by eliminating Caesar, they would make it possible to return to the old order. But they had underestimated the mood among the people. For many Romans, Caesar had been a benefactor who had brought bread, land, and victories. His death sparked outrage, and riots soon broke out. Mark Antony, one of his closest confidants, gave an impassioned speech in which he showed the wounds of Caesar and incited the people against the murderers. The conspirators had to flee, and instead of saving the Republic, a new phase of civil war followed. Caesar's dictatorship and assassination marked a turning point in Roman history. He had effectively ended the Republic, even if he formally maintained its institutions. His reforms laid the foundation for the later empire, but his violent death showed how deep the division was. The murder of Caesar did not eliminate the causes of the crisis, but exacerbated them. In the following years, new power struggles were to follow, which finally led to the autocracy of his adopted son Octavian, the later Augustus. Caesar thus remains one of the most dazzling figures of antiquity. General, statesman, reformer, and dictator, loved and hated at the same time. His name became the epitome of domination, his fate a reminder that power cannot be unlimited. But in truth, his death was not the end, but the beginning of a new epoch, the era of the emperors. After the assassination of Caesar in 44 BC, chaos reigned in Rome. The Senate, which had hoped that the act would lead to a return to the old republican order, faced an angry population that revered the dead dictator. The conspirators, who saw themselves as liberators, found little support. Instead, Caesar's supporters took the initiative. Above all, Marcus Antonius, Caesar's close confidant and consul of the year, knew how to take advantage of the mood among the people. With a moving eulogy in which he read Caesar's will and displayed his wounds, he turned the crowd against the murderers. The dictator's body was burned in the Forum, and the flames fueled hatred for the conspirators who fled Rome. The tension between the two men came to a head until it came to open war. In 31 BC, the decisive Battle of Actium on the west coast of Greece took place. Antony and Cleopatra led a huge fleet, but Octavian had a brilliant admiral at his side in Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. In a fierce naval battle, Octavian's troops achieved victory. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where they were pursued by Octavian's army a year later. When defeat was inevitable, they both committed suicide. Antony threw himself into his sword, Cleopatra chose the poisonous bite of a snake. Her death not only ended her personal tragedy, but also the last serious competition for Octavian. Now Octavian stood as the undisputed ruler. But he knew that after the years of dictatorships and civil wars, Rome reacted sensitively to any form of autocracy. That is why he did not present himself as a king or dictator, but as an innovator of the Republic. In 27 BC, he officially declared that he would resign all his extraordinary powers and return power to the Senate. In reality, this was a clever spectacle. The Senate immediately gave him new, comprehensive powers that secured him control over the army, provinces, and finances. In recognition, he was given the honorary name Augustus, the Exalted. This marked the beginning of a new era, the Principate. Octavian, now Augustus, knew like no other before him how to combine power and facade. Externally, the Republic remained with its institutions, with Senate, consuls, and magistrates. But the real power lay with Augustus, who was unassailable due to his control over the army and the provinces. He called himself Princeps, the first among equals, and presented himself as a modest servant of the state. In truth, he was the first Roman emperor, even if this title did not yet exist. The path from the death of Caesar to the battles between Octavian and Antony to the founding of the Principate shows how definitively the Republic had collapsed. The old structures had not withstood the rivalries of ambitious men, and in the end the one who surpassed all competitors with patience, cunning, and determination prevailed. Octavian was not a brilliant general like Caesar or Pompey, not an orator like Cicero, but he was a master of political staging and the balance of power. With him, A new order began that ended the civil wars and led Rome into an era of peace and prosperity. But this peace had its price: the freedom of the Republic. Chapter 21. Augustus and the founding of the Empire. With the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium and their death in Egypt, Octavian had eliminated the last serious competition. He stood there as the undisputed ruler of the entire Roman Empire, but he knew that power was a sensitive issue in Rome. Since the days of kings, the distrust of autocracy was deeply rooted in the consciousness of the Romans. Caesar had been murdered because he threatened the Republic as a dictator. Octavian therefore had to find a way to secure his power without appearing like a tyrant. His solution was a masterpiece of political staging: the founding of the Principality, the monarchy under republican guise. In 27 BC, Octavian appeared before the Senate and declared that he wanted to resign all extraordinary powers and return power to the institutions of the Republic. It was a spectacle that was to go down in history. The Senate, impressed and relieved at the same time, urged him to retain certain tasks in the interests of the state. He was given control of the most important provinces, those with the most legions, as well as command of the army. This meant that the real power remained in his hands. In recognition, he was given the honorary name of Augustus, the Sublime, and thus sealed the beginning of a new era. Augustus knew how to keep up appearances. Officially, the Republic remained in existence. The Senate met, consuls were elected, and the old offices were retained. But the reality was different. Augustus was the princeps, the first among equals, and all important decisions came from him. He did not call himself king or dictator, but princeps senatus, the first in the Senate, a title that sounded modest but unmistakably expressed his primacy. The basis of his power was the army. Augustus retained control of all the legions stationed in the most dangerous provinces. He reduced the number of legions to a level he could finance and created a standing army that was firmly tied to him. The soldiers received regular pay, and after their service they received land or pension from a specially established fund, the Aerarium Militare. In this way, Augustus ensured that the loyalty of the troops no longer depended on individual generals, but solely on him as supreme commander. But Augustus understood that military power alone was not enough. He also had to win the trust of the population and the elite. That is why he presented himself as the savior of the Republic, who brought peace and stability after the long years of civil wars. Under his rule, the so-called Pax Augusta began, a time of inner peace that promised security and prosperity to the people. In inscriptions and coins, he proclaimed that he had restored the Republic, even though in reality a new system had been born. In addition to the political reorganization, Augustus began comprehensive reforms. He reorganized the provinces by distinguishing between senatorial and imperial provinces. He left the prosperous and safe territories to the Senate, while he himself retained the frontier provinces in which the legions were stationed. This preserved the appearance that the Senate was still important, but the actual power remained with the emperor. The administration of the city of Rome was also modernized. Augustus introduced a police and fire brigade, reorganized the grain supply, and began major construction projects. Under his rule, temples, forums, and theaters were built, and he could proudly say that he had taken over a city of bricks and left one of marble. These buildings were not only embellishment, but also propaganda. They showed the greatness of Rome and the beneficence of the emperor. Another area to which Augustus paid special attention was moral politics. He was convinced that the decline of the Republic was also related to the decline of morals. That is why he passed laws that were intended to strengthen marriage and family. Marriages were encouraged, abundance of children was rewarded, but adultery was severely punished. He also tried to exemplify this ideal in his own family, but it was here that he suffered bitter defeats, as his daughter Julia led a dissolute life and finally had to be banished. Nevertheless, these moral laws shaped the image of Augustus as a ruler who sought not only military power but also social order. In foreign policy, Augustus relied on consolidation. He largely refrained from major conquests that could overstretch the empire and concentrated on securing the borders. He led successful campaigns in Hispania and the Alpine region, and built permanent border fortifications on the Rhine and Danube. However, the attempt to subjugate Germania as far as the Elbe failed dramatically when 3 Roman legions under Varus were destroyed by the Germanic tribes under Arminius in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD. This debacle came as a shock to Rome and caused Augustus to abandon any further expansion in this direction. Instead, He stabilized the border on the Rhine, which was to remain the line between the Roman and Germanic worlds for centuries. Religiously and ideologically, Augustus created a new basis for his rule. He presented himself as the chosen guardian of the gods, restored old cults, and introduced new religious rituals. In particular, the cult of the emperor's genius, i.e., his divine charisma, gained in importance. In the provinces, Augustus was already worshipped like a god during his lifetime, even though he officially appeared in Rome only as the highest priest, Pontifex Maximus. This combination of religion and politics made his rule sacred and unassailable. By the time Augustus died in 14 AD, he had ruled for 4 decades. His death marked the end of the Republic and the final establishment of the empire. The Senate declared him a god, and his name became a title. Caesar and Augustus became designations that every Roman emperor bore. The path from Octavian to Augustus was the path from the Republic to the empire. He showed that Rome could no longer return to the old order. The Republic was broken by its internal contradictions, and Augustus filled the power vacuum with a rule that masqueraded as restoration but actually meant a revolution. He was the first emperor of Rome, the founder of a new epoch in which Rome was no longer ruled by citizens, but by a single man who allowed himself to be celebrated as the father of the fatherland. Tiberius took office with restraint. He was an experienced general who had won victories in Germania and Pannonia, but as a ruler he was suspicious and withdrawn. In the beginning, he ruled cautiously, respected the institutions, and tried to continue in the spirit of Augustus. But soon he withdrew more and more. He eventually left Rome altogether and resided on the island of Capri, where he lived isolated from the capital. He left power to his confidants, above all the Praetorian prefect Cianus. He used his position to spin intrigues, eliminate opponents, and almost seize power himself before he was seen through by Tiberius and executed. After Tiberius, Gaius Caesar, better known as Caligula, ascended the throne. His nickname, Little Boot, came from his childhood as the son of a popular general, Germanicus, who often took him to the camp. Initially, Caligula was celebrated by the people, for he seemed to make people forget the dark times of Tiberius. But soon he showed a different side. Caligula fell into excesses, had lavish games organized, and demanded divine worship even during his lifetime. The anecdote that he had planned to appoint his horse Incitatus as consul became famous and notorious. Whether as a joke, provocation, or actual intention remains unclear, but it shows the absurdity of his rule. Nero's reign ended in chaos. His wastefulness, cruelty, and disregard for traditional elites led to riots. In 68 AD, the governor Galba rose up against him, and soon his own troops abandoned him. Nero fled Rome and finally committed suicide with the words, "Qualis artifex perio, what an artist perishes with me." With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. When Nero took over in 54 AD, he was still under the influence of his mother Agrippina and his teacher Seneca. At first his reign seemed to inspire hope, for he was young, of noble birth, and seemed ready to lead the empire into a new flowering. But it soon became apparent that Nero had other ambitions. He loved music, theater, and art far more than the troubles of state affairs. His passion for the spotlight was stronger than his responsibility as emperor. Nevertheless, he initially remained under the control of his advisors, who ran the business and ensured a certain stability. But the older Nero became, the more he emancipated himself from their influence and the more clearly his dark sides became apparent. A decisive turning point in his reign was his relationship with his mother Agrippina. She had brought him to the throne by presumably having her husband, Emperor Claudius, poisoned and ensuring that Nero was adopted and installed as his successor. But their dominance increasingly bothered the young emperor. At first he let her appear at court and participate in decisions, but soon he perceived her as a threat. Nero feared their power and influence over the Praetorians. Finally, he decided to eliminate them. The first assassination attempts, a prepared ship that was about to collapse at sea, failed. In the end, Nero had her brutally murdered. In doing so, He showed that he was prepared not to even shy away from matricide in order to secure his rule. The following period was marked by excesses and waste. Nero loved sumptuous parties, elaborate games, and artistic performances. He forced senators and knights to serve him as an audience when he appeared as a singer or actor and demanded applause for his performances. For many Romans, this was a scandal, because an emperor who appeared on stage was considered dishonored. But Nero enjoyed the applause and believed that he found his true calling in art. Then came the year 64 AD, which would forever be associated with his name. On the night of July 19th, a devastating fire broke out in Rome. The flames spread rapidly, as many houses were built of wood and the narrow streets of the city fanned the fire. Rome burned for days, large parts of the city were destroyed, countless people lost their homes, and temples as well as public buildings fell victim to the flames. The disaster plunged the capital into despair and chaos. Soon rumors circulated that Nero himself had started the fire. It was said that he stood on a tower during the flames, watched the destruction, and sang on his lyre. Whether this is true is uncertain, but the narrative has shaped the image of the emperor to the present day. It is more likely that the fire was an accident that could easily occur in an overcrowded and poorly organized city. But Nero was suspected of having been involved himself, because soon after the fire he began to implement large construction plans that had only been made possible by the destruction. In fact, Nero took the opportunity to reshape Rome according to his ideas. He had wide roads laid out, the construction of stone houses prescribed, and more safety provided. But at the same time he began to build his massive Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This palace, which stretched over a huge area, was of immeasurable luxury. With gold-decorated halls, artificial lakes, gardens, and a monumental statue of Nero himself, it was a symbol of excessive self-staging. For the people, who were still suffering from the consequences of the fire, however, this construction was a slap in the face. To deflect suspicion from himself, Nero looked for scapegoats. He chose the Christians, a still small but growing community that was suspicious to many Romans because they practiced their own religion, stayed away from traditional festivals, and did not sacrifice to the Roman gods. Nero accused them of setting the fire and began a cruel pursuit. Many Christians were arrested and executed in a bestial manner. Some were crucified, others sewn into animal skins and mauled by dogs, others burned as living torches at night festivals. This was the beginning of one of the first major persecutions of Christians in history, which consolidated the image of Nero as a cruel tyrant. Despite the disaster and the increasing criticism, Nero stuck to his lifestyle. He traveled to Greece, took part in games, and forced the organizers to award him victories. He presented himself as an artist, while discontent grew in Rome. The elite despised him, the people suffered from his wastefulness, and even the army began to turn away from him. Finally, in 68 AD, uprisings broke out. Governors rose up against him in the provinces, and resistance also formed in the Senate. When the Praetorian Guard broke away from him, Nero was completely isolated. He fled Rome and desperately searched for a hiding place. Finally, as his pursuers approached, he decided to commit suicide. As he hesitated, a faithful servant thrust the sword into his body. His last words are said to have been, "Qualis artifex perio," what an artist perishes with me. Nero's death marked the end not only of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, but also of an era in which the contradictions of Roman imperial rule became apparent. On the one hand, Nero had actually helped to make Rome more modern and safer by issuing new building regulations after the fire and redesigning the city. On the other hand, his excess, his extravagance, and his disregard for traditional values destroyed trust in the imperial leadership. The Great Fire of Rome thus became a symbol of his rule. Whether he had caused it or not ultimately no longer mattered. In the memory of posterity, he remained the emperor who sang while the city was burning, who blamed innocent Christians, and who put himself above the good of the empire. Nero's end showed how fragile the system of the Principates still was. The emperor's power depended not only on his office, but also on his ability to retain the trust of the Senate, the people, and the army. When he lost this trust, his rule collapsed like a house of cards. The death of Nero plunged the empire into a new crisis, the so-called Four Emperors' Year, in which various generals fought for power. But despite his inglorious end, Nero remained one of the most fascinating figures in Roman history. He embodied the extremes of the imperial era, the combination of art and cruelty, of luxury and downfall, of splendor and flames. The Great Fire of Rome was not only a catastrophe for the city, but also a symbol of the destructive power of a ruler who put himself above everything. Chapter 25. The Year of the Four Emperors. The death of Nero in June 68 AD marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled the Roman Empire for almost a century since Augustus. But the end of this line did not mean a return to stability, but plunged Rome into a phase of insecurity and violence. For there was no clear successor, and the question of who should rule the empire was no longer decided in the Senate, but on the battlefield. The army, which had become the decisive power since the days of Caesar, now determined the fate of the empire. Thus began the dramatic year 69 AD, which went down in history as the Year of the Four Emperors. Even before Nero's death, resistance had been stirring in the provinces. In Spain, the governor Servius Sulpicius Galba rose against him. Galba was an experienced man, of noble birth and military merits, but also of severity and toughness. When the Praetorian Guard turned away from Nero, Galba marched to Rome and was recognized as emperor by the Senate. This was the beginning of his short reign, but it was ill-fated from the beginning. Galba was unyielding and thrifty. He refused the soldiers the usual gifts of money and had many officers and opponents executed. Instead of winning gratitude and loyalty, he sowed mistrust and hatred. One of his own officers, Marcus Salvius Otho, took advantage of his weakness. Otho was ambitious and disappointed because Galba had passed him over in the question of succession. In January 69 AD, he bribed the Praetorian Guard, who murdered Galba and proclaimed him emperor himself. Otho took power, but his rule was just as uncertain as that of his predecessor. In the north, on the Rhine, the legion stationed there had already proclaimed their own candidate, Aulus Vitellius, the governor of Germania Inferior. Vitellius was popular with the military because of his generosity and forbearance, and his troops swore allegiance to him. In the autumn of 69 AD, the troops of Vitellius and the followers of Vespasian met in a second battle at Bedriacum. This time, Vespasian's army was victorious, and Vitellius' troops fled. Chaos broke out in Rome when Vitellius tried to stay in power. But the advancing legions invaded the city, bloody street fighting ensued, and Vitellius was finally captured and brutally murdered. His body was dragged through the streets before being thrown into the Tiber. But as turbulent as the year was, it produced a ruler in Vespasian who gave the empire new stability. Unlike his predecessors, he had no illusions about the weakness of the institutions. He built his power on a clear connection between the emperor and the army, but at the same time strengthened the administration and finances. With him, the Flavian dynasty began, which was to rule the empire for the next decades. The Year of the Four Emperors remains a drastic example of the dangers of unclear succession and the fragility of the Roman system. It showed that the emperor was no longer determined by descent or Senate decision, but by the strength of his legions and the ability to gain loyalty. It was a year of violence, arbitrariness, and uncertainty, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in which the empire became more consolidated. The year 69 AD was thus a lesson for the Roman Empire. The power of the emperor stood and fell with the loyalty of the military, and dynastic succession alone could not guarantee stability. It was a year that revealed the price of uncertainty, but also paved the way for a new line of rulers that emerged stronger from the turmoil. Chapter 26. The Flavian Dynasty. With Vespasian's victory in 69 AD, the chaotic year of the four emperors ended and a new era began. The Julio-Claudian line was extinguished, and power passed to a family that came from far simpler backgrounds. The Flavians, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, were to rule the empire for almost 3 decades and give it a phase of relative stability after the turmoil. It was not a glamorous dynasty like that of Augustus, but its rulers were characterized by pragmatism, austerity, and a clear orientation towards military strength. Under the Flavians, Rome recovered from the battles of the previous years, and at the same time buildings were erected that marked the cityscape forever. Vespasian, the founder of the dynasty, was a man of humble origin from the Italian Sabine country. He did not come from the venerable families of Rome, but had worked his way up through discipline, diligence, and military successes. He had already fought in Britain under Claudius, and later he waged the war against the rebellious Jews in the east. When he was proclaimed emperor in 69 AD, he was already an experienced officer, whose loyalty and energy were appreciated by his legions. In contrast to his immediate predecessors, he was sober, thrifty, and determined to bring order back to the empire. But for the Jewish population, it meant a catastrophe that was to shape their history for centuries. Despite these catastrophes, he remained popular with the people. His mildness and humanity made him one of the few emperors who ruled without major intrigue or hatred. But his reign was short. As early as 81 AD, he died unexpectedly, probably of an illness, although some rumors spoke of a poisoning by his brother Domitian. Domitian took power and ruled for almost a decade and a half, from 81 to 96 AD. He was a completely different type than his brother. Ambitious, strict, and suspicious. Initially, he successfully led the empire, secured the borders, and expanded the administration. He had magnificent buildings built and promoted art and culture. But over time, his rule became more and more autocratic. He demanded divine worship even during his lifetime, had opponents executed, and waged a veritable terror against the Senate. With Domitian's death, the Flavian dynasty ended. It had given Rome three rulers who were very different: the sober and pragmatic Vespasian, the mild and popular Titus, and the stern and feared Domitian. Together, they had stabilized the empire after a period of turmoil, strengthened the influence of the provinces, and set standards with buildings such as the Colosseum that still exist today. While the emperors controlled the fate of the empire and the legions provided security at the borders, everyday life took place inside the empire that was the true face of Rome for millions of people. The life of the Romans in the first century was marked by social contrasts, but also by an astonishing diversity that made the empire a melting pot of cultures. Between luxury villas and miserable tenements, between boulevards and narrow streets, between philosophy and superstition, a world unfolded that was as fascinating as it was contradictory. At the beginning of the imperial period, more than 1 million people probably lived in Rome itself. This made the capital the largest urban center in the ancient world. The city was a cosmos of its own, full of noise, smells, and movement. The upper class lived in magnificent townhouses, the so-called domus, which were built around an inner courtyard, the atrium. Here the patricians received their guests, held their business, and showed their wealth through marble, mosaics, and precious wall paintings. But the majority of the population lived in insulae, multi-story tenement houses, often made of wood and inferior materials. These buildings were prone to fire and collapse, and the narrowness made life difficult for the residents. Daily life was strongly determined by social differences. Wealthy Romans could start their day with a bath in the thermal baths, then devote themselves to political or business discussions and enjoy an opulent meal in the evening. These banquets were social events where wine, exotic food, and music were performed. Not only bread, olives, and cheese landed on the tables, but also delicacies such as oysters, peacocks, or dishes seasoned with honey. For ordinary citizens, on the other hand, the diet usually consisted of bread, porridge, legumes, and occasionally some meat or fish. The streets of Rome were full of merchants, craftsmen, and beggars. Markets offered goods from all provinces of the empire: spices from India, silk from China, glassware from Syria, wine from Gaul, and oil from Spain. Rome was the hub of a global trade network that spanned the entire known world. The streets were crowded with wagons, slaves, and free citizens, while street vendors loudly advertised their wares. Noise and hectic pace characterized everyday life, and it was not uncommon for ordinances to have to be issued to contain the chaos. A central element of Roman life were the thermal baths. These public bathing facilities were much more than places for personal hygiene. They were meeting places where people did business, met friends, or simply relaxed. For a small entrance fee, you could stay here for hours, in the warm or cold bath, doing sports, or in the gardens. Emperors such as Nero, Titus, or later Caracalla had gigantic thermal complexes built that could accommodate thousands of people. They symbolized the emperor's beneficences and gave people the feeling of being part of a large community. The theater and the games in the amphitheater were also an integral part of everyday life. Dramas and comedies attracted spectators, but even more popular were the chariot races in the Circus Maximus and the gladiator fights in the Colosseum. Chariot races, in which teams competed against each other in different colors, were able to inspire tens of thousands of spectators. The fan clubs of the Blues or Greens were just as passionate as modern football fans. Gladiator games, on the other hand, offered bloody entertainment in which men, and sometimes women, fought against each other or against wild animals. These games were not only for entertainment, but also had a political function. They demonstrated the generosity of the emperor, who appeased the people with spectacles. Religion played an omnipresent role in everyday life. The Romans believed in a variety of gods that influenced daily life: Jupiter for justice, Venus for love, Mars for war, Ceres for harvest. In each house there were small house altars where the family made sacrifices to the Lares and Penates, the patron gods. Religious festivals crisscrossed the calendar, and processions and offerings were integral parts of public life. At the same time, more and more foreign cults penetrated the empire. The Egyptian cult of Isis, the worship of Mithras from Persia, or the early Christian communities, which initially lived in secret and often met with mistrust. Family life was strongly patriarchal. The paterfamilias, the head of the family, had almost unlimited legal power over his wife, children, and slaves. He decided on marriages, on the property, and even on the life of newborns. Women were formally excluded from politics, but in wealthy households they were able to exert great influence through education, influence, and clever networks. Children were involved in the duties of the family at an early age, and the education of the boys was based on their social position. While the sons of the upper class learned grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy, the children of the ordinary bourgeoisie usually received only a basic education or went directly into a trade. An essential feature of Roman everyday life was the presence of slaves. Almost every household that could afford it had slaves who worked in the household, in the workshops, or in the fields. In Rome itself, they fulfilled a variety of tasks, from water carriers to teachers to accountants. Some slaves gained wealth through diligence and proximity to their masters and were even able to buy their freedom. Freedmen, the former slaves, formed an important social class and played an important role, especially in trade and crafts. Nevertheless, dependence on slave labor remained a core point of Roman society, and uprisings such as the Spartacus revolt were reminders of the threat to this order. The nights in Rome were dangerous. Without street lighting, the alleys were dark, robbers and thugs lurked, and those who moved in the evening hours did so at their own risk. Wealthy citizens were accompanied by slaves with lamps, while the poor often withdrew to their cramped apartments. Despite the dangers, the city developed a special liveliness that lasted until late at night, with taverns, food stalls, and festivals. Everyday Roman life in the 1st century was thus a mirror of the greatness and contradictions of the empire. It combined luxury and misery, order and chaos, tradition and innovation. It was life in a world metropolis that was shaped by millions of people from all parts of the empire. Here senators and slaves, philosophers and gladiators, merchants and peasants lived side by side, and all were part of the vast organism called Rome. Chapter 28. Trajan and the Greatest Expansion of Rome. When Emperor Nerva died in 98 AD, his adopted son Marcus Ulpius Traianus, better known as Trajan, took over the rule of the Roman Empire. It marked the beginning of an era that many historians later described as the high point of Roman history. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial expansion, but at the same time a flowering of culture, architecture, and administration. He was not only a capable general, but also a just ruler whose name remained associated with the ideal image of an emperor long after his death. Later, the Senate often honored other rulers with the words, "May you be happier than Augustus and better than Trajan." Trajan came from Italica in the province of Hispania Baetica, near present-day Seville. This made him the first emperor who was not born in Italy. His rise reflected the increasing integration of the provinces, which had long since ceased to be just vassals of Rome, but could themselves become bearers of power. Trajan had a solid military career and distinguished himself in the service of the frontiers, especially in Germania. When Nerva adopted him, it was a clever move. The old emperor, without heirs of his own, won the loyalty of the army through the popular general, and Trajan was accepted as the future ruler. After his accession to the throne, Trajan immediately showed that he was a different type of emperor than many of his predecessors. He was not an aloof autocrat, but sought proximity to his soldiers and citizens. He became famous for enduring the same hardships as his legionnaires in the military, marching with them, sharing simple meals and renouncing luxury. This modesty and his personal courage made him extremely popular with the army. In Rome itself, he appeared as a benefactor, distributing generous donations of grain, promoting public buildings and taking into account the interests of the people. But Trajan was above all a conqueror. His gaze was directed towards the kingdom of Dacia, which lay in the territory of today's Romania. Dacia was rich in gold and other resources, and its king Decebalus had already challenged Rome several times. For Trajan, the war against Dacia was not only economically rewarding, but also a way to gain glory. Between 101 and 106 AD, he led two major campaigns that ended with the complete subjugation of Dacia. The Roman legions crossed the Danube over a gigantic bridge built by the architect Apollodorus of Damascus and penetrated deep into enemy territory. After fierce fighting, the Dacian capital of Sarmizegetusa fell, and Decebalus took his own life. Dacia became a Roman province, and its riches flowed to Rome. The triumph over Dacia was a high point in Trajan's reign. In Rome he had a huge victory celebration held and built the Forum Traiani, the largest and most magnificent of all imperial forums. At the center of this forum was Trajan's column, which has been preserved to this day. It depicts the scenes of the Dacian War in a spiral relief: marches, battles, sieges, but also scenes of discipline, organization, and Roman engineering. The column served not only as a monument to Trajan's victory, but also as a kind of stone chronicle that captured the image of the emperor as a victorious general for all time. But Trajan was not satisfied with Dacia. He turned his gaze to the east, to the mighty Parthian Empire, which had been Rome's great rival for centuries. In 114 AD, he began a campaign that took him deep into Mesopotamia. Trajan conquered Armenia, Syria, and penetrated as far as Babylon and the Persian Gulf. Rome was thus at the height of its power, larger than ever before. The conquest of Mesopotamia seemed to be tantamount to the completion of the empire, and Trajan was perhaps already dreaming of even greater goals. But the Parthian War also showed the limits of Roman expansion. The conquered territories were difficult to hold, supplies difficult, and uprisings soon arose in the conquered cities. The Jewish population in the east in particular put up fierce resistance, and Trajan had to withdraw some of his troops. When he fell ill on his way back to Rome in 117 AD, it was clear that the eastern conquests could not be secured permanently. He died in Cilicia in the same year and was transferred to Rome. His successor Hadrian gave up most of the territories beyond the Euphrates in order not to overstretch the empire. Despite these setbacks, Trajan was remembered as the emperor who led Rome to its outermost borders. His rule was characterized not only by military successes, but also by domestic political benefits. He promoted a program to support poor children, the so-called alimenta system, in which loans were granted to landowners, whose interest was used to feed and educate the children. He had roads, bridges, and aqueducts built, founded new colonies, and strengthened the infrastructure of the empire. Rome itself experienced a wave of construction projects under his rule, which transformed the city into a monument to its greatness. Trajan was also remarkable in his relationship with the Senate. He respected the senatorial elite, let them participate in decisions, and treated the members with dignity. Unlike tyrants like Caligula or Domitian, who had despised the Senate, he won its recognition. Many senators saw in him the ideal of an emperor: strong, just, generous, and yet modest. His rule is therefore still considered a high point of the Principate, in which the balance between imperial authority and republican traditions was maintained. His death left behind a mixture of admiration and longing. He had led the empire to its very limit, but at the same time his example showed that there was a natural limit to expansion. Rome's resources were not unlimited, and too much expansion could jeopardize stability. Nevertheless, the name Trajan remained inseparable from the image of the victorious emperor who led the Roman Empire to its greatest expansion. Trajan's legacy lived on not only in buildings and military campaigns, but also in the memory of a time when Rome was at the height of its power. He embodied the ideal of a ruler who combined military strength with social responsibility. His reign was an era of splendor, which subsequent generations regarded as a benchmark. No emperor before him had led Rome so far, and only a few after him were to reach his greatness. Chapter 29: Hadrian and the Borders of the Empire. When Trajan died in 117 AD, Rome was at the height of its territorial expansion. But his successor Publius Aelius Hadrianus, better known as Hadrian, chose a different course. He was not the conqueror like Trajan, but the preserver. For Hadrian, the emperor's task was not to subjugate new provinces, but to secure the existing borders and consolidate the empire internally. In doing so, he initiated a fundamental change in Roman politics, away from limitless expansion towards a defensive strategy that was to ensure the survival of the empire for centuries. Hadrian was a great-nephew of Trajan and also came from Italica in the province of Hispania. He had received a comprehensive education, spoke fluent Greek and was interested in philosophy, architecture, and art at an early age. His personality was marked by a deep dichotomy. On the one hand, he was a strict military man who disciplined the army and often appeared in soldiers' clothing himself. On the other hand, he was an intellectual spirit who wrote poetry, was enthusiastic about philosophy, and openly lived out his love for Greek culture. This contrast made him one of the most fascinating figures among the Roman emperors. Right at the beginning of his reign, Hadrian made a far-reaching decision. The territories conquered under Trajan in Mesopotamia and Armenia were abandoned. For many Romans, this was a shock, because it seemed as if the emperor was betraying the legacy of his predecessor. But Hadrian realized that the resources of the empire were not sufficient to hold these distant territories permanently. Instead, he drew a clear border on the Euphrates and concentrated on securing the existing provinces. In doing so, he gave up territory, but he created a solid foundation that stabilized the empire in the long term. A symbol of this new policy was Hadrian's Wall in Britain. In the north of the province of Britannia ran the border to the restless areas of the Celtic tribes, which repeatedly rose up against Rome. To protect the province, Hadrian had a monumental wall built that stretched for more than 120 kilometers from coast to coast. With its watchtowers, forts, and gates, it was not only a military bulwark, but also an expression of Roman power. It signaled, "Rome reaches this far, and no further." The rampart was a masterpiece of Roman engineering and remains one of the most impressive relics of the empire to this day. But Hadrian did not limit himself to Britain. In many provinces he had borders fortified, camps built, and roads built. His extensive travels made him an emperor who knew the empire better than anyone else. He spent almost half of his reign outside Rome, inspecting troops, visiting cities, and ensuring that the provinces remained closely connected to the center. These trips made him popular, but also controversial, as he was often away from the capital for longer than the Senate considered appropriate. Culturally, Hadrian was an ardent admirer of the Greek world. He spent a lot of time in Athens, had magnificent buildings built there, and promoted Greek culture like hardly any other emperor. Under him, the Pantheon in Rome was completed, one of the greatest buildings of antiquity, which still impresses today with its huge dome. He also had monumental temples built in Athens and elevated the city to a center of culture. His enthusiasm for Greece went so far that he was sometimes called Greekulus, a little Greek, a nickname that was meant to be both mocking and admiring. Hadrian's personal side was shaped by his relationship with Antinous, a young man from Bithynia who became his closest companion. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 AD under unexplained circumstances, Hadrian was filled with deep grief. He posthumously elevated the young man to God, had statues of him erected in many cities, and even founded a new city in Egypt called Antinopolis. This deification of a personal companion was extraordinary and showed how much Hadrian was guided by emotions. At the same time, she created a cult that was popular in many parts of the empire and represents a rare example of personal religiosity in the imperial era. Politically and militarily, however, Hadrian was not only a preserver, but also a strict ruler. This was particularly evident in the Jewish revolt of 132 to 135 AD, also known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. When Hadrian announced the construction of a Roman colony on the site of the destroyed temple in Jerusalem and restricted the Jewish faith, a huge uprising broke out. Under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, the Jews rose up and inflicted heavy losses on the Romans. But in the end, Roman superiority prevailed. The uprising was brutally suppressed, hundreds of thousands of Jews lost their lives, and Jerusalem was transformed into the Roman colony of Aelia Capitolina. The name Judea disappeared from the maps. Instead, people spoke of Syria Palestina, a deliberate attempt to erase Jewish identity. Hadrian was an emperor who combined opposites. He was cultured and brutal, peace-loving and merciless, a traveler and a centralist. Under his rule, the empire did not experience any great conquests, but a consolidation that was perhaps more important than any campaign. He understood that Rome could not grow indefinitely, and laid the foundation for a defensive strategy that would allow the empire to survive for many centuries to come. When Hadrian died in 138 AD, he had had a fundamental influence on the empire. His successor Antoninus Pius, whom he had adopted, took over an empire that was secure, prosperous, and orderly. Hadrian was buried in Rome in a magnificent mausoleum, now known as Castel Sant'Angelo. His name remained associated with buildings, borders, and cultural achievements, but also with harshness and oppression. Hadrian was not a conqueror like Trajan, but he was the architect of stability. Under him, Rome became an empire of clear borders, fortified lines, and cultural flourishing. His policies saved Rome from getting lost in adventure and laid the groundwork for the so-called Golden Age of adoptive emperors, during which the empire would experience one of its longest periods of peace. Chapter 30. Antoninus Pius and the Time of Inner Peace. After Hadrian's death in 138 AD, his adopted son Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arrius Antoninus, better known as Antoninus Pius, took over the reign. He was not a man of campaigns or great conquests, but an emperor whose name stands for an era of inner peace and stability. His reign from 138 to 161 AD is considered one of the quietest and most prosperous in the history of the Roman Empire. While other emperors shone with wars or building projects, Antoninus Pius left behind the image of a ruler who embodied order, justice, and continuity. Antoninus came from a distinguished senatorial family near Lanuvium, not far from Rome. He was a man of education and decency, whose life had passed inconspicuously before his accession to the throne. Hadrian probably chose him precisely because he appeared reliable and dutiful. When he was adopted by Hadrian, Antoninus undertook to adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as his successors, thus continuing the line of adoptive emperors. This structure ensured a clear succession and prevented disputes over imperial dignity. The special thing about the reign of Antoninus Pius was that it was almost completely free of major wars. Although there were smaller uprisings on the borders, for example in Britain or on the Danube, Antoninus himself did not undertake any military campaigns. Instead, he relied on his governors and generals to control the situation in the provinces. His nickname Pius is said to come from the fact that he was not only pious and God-fearing, but also dutiful towards his adoptive father Hadrian, whose decisions he loyally implemented. Many historians see in him the ideal of a peace-loving ruler who did not seek glory on the battlefield, but focused on the well-being of his subjects. In Rome itself, he strove for a fair administration. He ensured that laws were observed, appointed fair judges, and ensured a certain moderation in tax policy. He became particularly known for his humanity in dealing with slaves. While slavery remained a foundation of society, Antoninus enacted laws that restricted the worst abuses. A master was no longer allowed to kill his slave with impunity, and in cases of extreme cruelty, slaves could seek protection from the authorities. He also promoted the rights of municipalities and cities in the provinces by strengthening their self-government and resolving conflicts through mediation. His reign was also characterized by a clever fiscal policy. He did not lead costly campaigns, which meant that he spared the state treasury. Instead, he invested in infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, and port facilities were improved, which facilitated trade and supplies to the empire. Under him, long-distance trade with India and China flourished, and luxury goods such as silk, spices, and precious stones reached Rome in large quantities. The empire experienced an economic boom that was built on the stable foundation of peace. Religiously, Antoninus followed Hadrian's policies by cultivating traditional cults, but at the same time tolerating foreign religions. The persecution of Christians was less severe in his time, although there were always conflicts under his rule. However, he was not driven by a fanatical religious policy, but sought balance and the preservation of social peace. His attitude to power was particularly remarkable. Antoninus lived a simple life, renounced great excesses, and maintained a modest lifestyle. He ruled more by example and authority than by coercion. His relationship with the Senate was good, and he respected its dignity without questioning imperial authority. At a time when Rome was traumatized by the tyranny of some emperors, he seemed like a calm Pole who enjoyed trust and respect. He carefully prepared his successors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus for their task. During his reign, he increasingly brought Marcus Aurelius into the affairs of government, so that he could already gain experience. The continuity of power was important to him, and so he created the conditions for the era of adoptive emperors to continue to exist. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 AD, he had been emperor for over 20 years, a long and peaceful reign that was rare in the history of the empire. His death was accompanied by deep mourning, and the Senate declared him a god. His name remained synonymous with mildness, a sense of duty and peace. The reign of Antoninus Pius shows that greatness does not always have to lie in conquests or monumental buildings. Sometimes it consists in the ability to maintain peace, promote justice, and maintain the kingdom without unnecessary burdens. Under him, the Roman Empire experienced a period that could almost be described as the golden age of peace. It was the heyday of the Principate, a moment in which Rome was not torn apart by civil wars, usurpations, or despotism, but existed in calm stability. Chapter 31. Marcus Aurelius and Philosophy on the Imperial Throne. With the death of Antoninus Pius in 161 AD, the reign of his adopted son Marcus Aurelius, one of the most remarkable figures of the Roman imperial period, began. Marcus Aurelius was not only the ruler of the greatest empire of antiquity, but also a philosopher whose ideas continue to have an impact today. His life embodied the constant conflict between the harsh reality of power and the ideal of inner serenity that he sought in his writings. He was an emperor who, more than anyone else, felt the burden of rule and yet tried to bear it in the spirit of philosophy. Marcus Aurelius came from a respected family and was influenced by education and philosophy from an early age. He was considered a serious and modest young man who stayed away from luxury and excess. Emperor Hadrian had his eye on him as a child and made sure that he was taught by the best teachers. He was particularly influenced by Stoic philosophy, which understood life as a test in which it was a matter of preserving virtue and self-control. Early on, he was called the Philosopher Prince, and his later work, The Self-Reflections, is a unique testimony of a ruler who reflected on his own life and questioned the sense of power and duty. After the death of Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius ascended the throne together with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus. This was the first time in Roman history that a dual power began. Officially, they shared power, but in practice, Marcus Aurelius played the leading role, as he had the greater prestige and personality. Lucius Verus, however, was useful as he took on military duties while Marcus directed the internal affairs. The years of their joint rule were marked by great challenges. Soon a war broke out in the east against the Parthian Empire. Lucius Verus led the Roman troops and, after several campaigns, was able to achieve a victory that secured Rome's control of Armenia and Mesopotamia. But with the returning soldiers came a catastrophe that shook the empire: the Antonine Plague. This disease, which was probably smallpox or a form of measles, spread rapidly and claimed millions of lives. Entire cities were depopulated, armies decimated, and the economy plunged into a deep crisis. The plague was to accompany the empire for decades to come and was one of the greatest catastrophes in its history. No sooner had the empire recovered from this blow than new threats broke out on the borders. In the north, Germanic tribes such as the Marcomanni and Quadi crossed the Danube and invaded Roman territory. These invasions were part of a larger movement of peoples that put increasing pressure on the empire. Marcus Aurelius himself went to the front and spent many years of his life in field camps on the Danube. The so-called Marcomannic Wars were bloody and grueling, but they showed the emperor's determination to defend the empire. It was precisely in these difficult years that Marcus Aurelius wrote down the thoughts that later became known as self-reflections. They are not works of self-expression, but personal notes that he wrote for himself. In it, he tried to strengthen himself in the spirit of the Stoa by remembering virtue, duty, and the transience of life. He wrote about the importance of serenity in the face of fate, about the need to fulfill one's duties, and about the finiteness of all things. It is not the things themselves that worry us, but our ideas about things, he noted, and in such sentences the Stoic wisdom that accompanied him on the imperial throne resonates. When Lucius Verus died in 169 AD, Marcus Aurelius ruled alone. He continued the fight against the Germanic tribes with tireless energy and even planned to create new provinces in the conquered territories north of the Danube. But the ongoing plague, the exhaustion of the troops, and the financial burdens ruined these plans. Nevertheless, he managed to stabilize the Danube border and save the empire from collapse. Marcus Aurelius is remembered in history as the emperor who, between battles and epidemics, between philosophy and duty, tried to bring humanity and wisdom to rule. His life showed that even a ruler who held the greatest power of his time suffered from the same questions as any other human being, about meaning, transience, and duty to himself and others. He was a ruler against his will, who felt the burden of the crown as a burden, but found greatness in it. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, he left the Roman Empire to his only surviving son, Commodus. In doing so, he broke with the tradition of adoptive emperors, who had always chosen their successors according to suitability. This break was to have serious consequences. Commodus began a phase that many historians consider to be the actual beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire. Although the empire was still powerful on the outside, the structure began to erode internally. Commodus's personality, his excesses, and his disregard for traditions weakened the reputation of the empire and laid the foundation for future crises. Commodus was still young when he took over, barely 19 years old. It became apparent early on that he was very different from his father. While Marcus Aurelius was dutiful, serious, and philosophical, Commodus loved luxury, pleasure, and the limelight. He did not see himself primarily as the guardian of the empire, but as the center of a personal world of brilliance in which he wanted to be revered and cheered. This attitude not only made him controversial among the people, but also alienated him from the Senate and the elite, which did not see him as a worthy successor to the philosopher-emperor. One of his greatest passions was the arena. Commodus considered himself a gladiator and appeared in battles himself, a behavior that was scandalous for a Roman emperor. Gladiators were considered dishonorable, and the fact that the emperor himself slipped into this role was an affront to Roman dignity for many. Nevertheless, the people loved these spectacular performances, and Commodus enjoyed the applause. He fought not only against humans, but also against wild animals, and was celebrated for his victories. Of course, the outcome of these fights was assured, but Commodus saw himself as an invincible hero, even the embodiment of Hercules. He had himself depicted in lion skins and with a club, minted coins with his image as a god, and claimed divine worship. While he lost himself in his excesses, he left the actual affairs of state to his favorites and confidants. This led to a period of intrigue and abuse of power. Men like Seioterus, Cleander, or later the Praetorian prefect Letus used their proximity to the emperor to sell offices and privileges. Corruption was rampant, and the administration of the empire fell into disrepair. The Senate had little influence, and anyone who opposed Commodus risked his life. Numerous senators and nobles were executed or expropriated, often simply because they were suspected of being a threat to the emperor. But it was not only the elite who suffered under his rule. The people also felt the dark sides of his policies. While Commodus spent huge sums of money on games and personal amusements, he neglected the finances of the empire. The state treasury was plundered, new taxes were introduced, and supplies were endangered. Although he tried to pacify the people with bread and circuses, discontent grew behind the shiny facade. Commodus's life was assassinated several times. His own sister Lucilla is said to have been involved in a conspiracy, but it failed and ended with her execution. Other attacks followed, but time and again he narrowly escaped death. This constant threat increased his suspicion, and he reacted with increasing cruelty. Executions, exiles, and confiscations became commonplace, and the atmosphere in Rome was one of fear and uncertainty. His end finally came through an intrigue from his own ranks. In 192 AD, Commodus planned to start the new year with a spectacular appearance. He wanted to appear as a gladiator in the Colosseum and be proclaimed consul in gladiator's garb. For Rome's elite, this was the final proof of his madness. His closest confidants, including his lover Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Letus, decided to act. On December 31, 192, Marcia tried to kill him with poison. When the plan failed, an athlete named Narcissus was assigned to strangle Commodus in his bath. Thus ended the life of the emperor, who considered himself invincible, at the hands of a simple wrestler. With Commodus's death, a new crisis broke out. The Antonine dynasty, which had begun with Nerva and reached its peak under Marcus Aurelius, came to an end. His death plunged the empire into the so-called Year of the Five Emperors, in which various aspirants fought for power. It was a foretaste of the increasing instabilities that were to shake the empire in the 3rd century. Commodus's reign thus marks a turning point. Under his predecessors, the empire had experienced a period of prosperity and stability that is considered the golden age of adoptive emperors. With him, an era of insecurity, corruption, and autocracy began. He was not an incompetent man in the sense of a lack of intelligence, But his character, his selfishness, and his need for admiration made him a dangerous ruler. He embodied the transformation of the empire from an institution that held the empire together to an instrument of personal power and vanity. Posterity judged him harshly. For many historians, he was the emperor who initiated the decline because he undermined the reputation of the office and weakened the foundations of the order. In the eyes of the Christians, who were also persecuted under his rule, he was a tyrant. But for the people who loved his games, he was perhaps less hated than the sources suggest from the point of view of the elite. So Commodus remains a figure of extremes. An emperor who saw himself as a god and gladiator, who named Rome after his name and in his hubris focused everything on himself. His life and his end show how dangerous it was when the fate of the empire depended on the personality of a single person. With him began the shadow that was to fall over the Roman Empire, a shadow that grew larger and larger in the centuries to come. Chapter 33. The Year of the Five Emperors and the Rise of Septimius Severus. With the murder of Commodus on New Year's Eve in 192 AD, not only the life of an emperor ended, but also the era of the Antonine dynasty. The death of the autocratic emperor left a power vacuum that immediately led to chaos. Within a few months, 5 men in succession would lay claim to the throne, and the empire plunged into one of the most turbulent periods in its history. This so-called Year of the Five Emperors revealed the deep insecurity of the Principate and showed once again that the loyalty of the armies and control over Rome were more important than any dynastic legitimacy. The first to succeed him was Publius Helvius Pertinax, an experienced senator and former general who had proven himself in various provinces. He was elevated to emperor by the Senate on January 1, 193, supported by the Praetorians who had murdered Commodus. Pertinax was a man of discipline and order, trying to clean up the finances and restore morale in the empire. But his strictness quickly made him unpopular with the Praetorians, who had expected lavish rewards. When he refused to meet their demands, they stormed his palace after only 3 months and murdered him. The next act was a farce that made clear the moral decay of Roman politics. After Pertinax's assassination, the Praetorians literally sold the throne to the highest bidder. In a kind of auction, Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, secured the favor of the guard by promising them a gigantic sum. He was recognized by the Senate, but his rule was hated from the beginning. The people despised him as a traitor who had bought the imperial throne, and the provincial legions did not recognize him either. 3 powerful generals were already rising up in the provinces, each making their own claims. In Britain, the legions proclaimed their governor Clodius Albinus emperor. In Syria, Pescennius Niger rose up, and in Pannonia, the present-day territories of Hungary and the surrounding area, Septimius Severus appeared on the scene. Severus was a man from Leptis Magna in North Africa, of Punic origin, who had distinguished himself through a long military career. He was ambitious, energetic, and politically skilled. With the Danube legions behind him, he had a powerful force that soon opened the way for him to Rome. When Severus marched with his army towards Italy, Julianus left all support. The Senate, sensing the winds of change, turned against him, and he was executed. In April 193, Severus entered Rome as a victor and had himself proclaimed emperor. But this was far from the end of the struggle for rule, as the 2 rivals Clodius Albinus and Pescennius Niger continued to oppose him. First, Severus turned against Niger, who had strong troops in Syria and Egypt. The battles dragged on for several years, but finally Severus was able to assert his superiority. In the Battle of Issus in 194, not far from the place where Alexander the Great had once defeated the Persians, he defeated Niger's army. Niger itself was captured and killed. This secured the east of the empire, and Severus also gained control of Egypt's granaries, which were indispensable for the supply of Rome. After the east was pacified, Severus turned against Albinus in Britain. At first he had appeased him with the title of Caesar and thus bought a truce, but the alliance was fragile. In 196 AD, Albinus declared himself Augustus, i.e. an equal emperor, and moved with his troops to Gaul. There in 197 the decisive Battle of Lugdunum, today's Lyon, took place. It was one of the largest battles of the Roman civil wars, in which more than 100,000 soldiers clashed. After a fierce struggle, Severus succeeded in defeating Albinus. He committed suicide, and Severus had his body desecrated to demonstrate his power. With the victory over both rivals, Septimius Severus stood as the undisputed ruler of the entire empire. He had prevailed, not through dynastic legitimacy, but through military strength and determination. This ushered in a new era, the Severan dynasty. It was to shape the empire for several decades and at the same time further consolidate the role of the military as a decisive power factor. Severus knew exactly to whom he owed his rise: the soldiers. He increased their salaries, granted them privileges, and ensured that their loyalty to him remained attached. At the same time, he weakened the Senate, which he saw not as a partner but as an opponent. Numerous senators who had supported his opponents were executed or expropriated. This finally shifted the balance in the empire in favor of the emperor and the military. The year of the 5 emperors had made it clear that the question of succession in the Principate had become a constant threat to stability. Without a clear regulation, power depended solely on the strength of the legions. With Septimius Severus, therefore, a development began in which the army became not only the pillar but the actual guarantor and judge of the empire. This change brought stability to the empire in the short term, but in the long term it weakened the political order and made Rome more vulnerable to internal conflicts. The people of Rome experienced this time as a succession of insecurity and violence. Emperors were raised and overthrown in quick succession, loyalties changed, and the city itself was threatened by civil wars on several occasions. But with Severus, order finally returned, albeit at the price of greater militarization of the state. The year of the 5 emperors of 193 AD was a key moment in Roman history. It showed how fragile the system of the Principate had become, and at the same time how much the empire depended on the personality and skill of individual men. At the end of this year and the ensuing battles, there was a new emperor, Septimius Severus, who was to lead the empire in a new direction, a direction in which the army became the all-decisive power and the Senate finally lost its importance. Chapter 34. The Reign of Septimius Severus. With the victory over Clodius Albinus in 197 AD, Septimius Severus had eliminated his rivals and stood there as the undisputed ruler of the Roman Empire. But his rise was only the beginning. Now he had to prove that he was not only a successful civil war commander, but also an emperor who knew how to stabilize and renew the empire. His reign was to last almost 2 decades, from 193 to 211 AD, and it marked the beginning of a new dynasty that permanently changed the face of Rome. Under Severus, the military gained a hitherto unimagined importance, while the Senate continued to lose influence. Severus came from Leptis Magna, a thriving city in North Africa that had become rich through trade and agriculture. This made him the first emperor from Africa and at the same time a symbol of the internationality of the empire. Unlike most of his predecessors, he did not come from a long-established Italic family, but embodied the rise of the provinces. His origins were unusual for many Romans, but it underlined how much the empire was now supported by a variety of cultures. After his seizure of power, Severus was faced with the task of consolidating his position. He knew that his power was not based on dynastic legitimacy, but on the strength of his armies. That is why he made the army his most important support. He significantly increased the pay of the legionnaires, allowed them to marry legally, which had previously been forbidden, and provided for them even after active service. In doing so, he won the lasting loyalty of the soldiers, but at the same time he set a precedent. From now on, the legions expected generous rewards from every emperor, and the army became the decisive power factor in the empire. He thoroughly reformed the Praetorian Guard in Rome, which had proven to be unreliable due to its role in the year of the 5 emperors. He dismissed the old Praetorians and replaced them with veterans from his own provincial troops who were personally devoted to him. In doing so, he ensured that the military protection of the capital was no longer in the hands of scheming guardsmen, but of loyal soldiers who were directly indebted to him. In foreign policy, Severus relied on expansion. Especially in the east, he sought confrontation with the Parthian Empire, Rome's eternal rival. In the years 197 to 198 he led a large campaign into Mesopotamia. He penetrated deep into the territory of the Parthians, conquered their capital Ctesiphon and declared Mesopotamia a Roman province. Although the Parthians were later able to regain parts, Severus' victory strengthened his prestige and secured his reputation as a successful general. He knew how to stage the military successes through triumphal processions in Rome, which underpinned his position as an invincible emperor. Inside the empire, Severus left behind an ambivalent image. On the one hand, he promoted the cities, especially his hometown of Leptis Magna, which he equipped with magnificent buildings and made a center of North Africa. He also built in Rome itself, where, among other things, he had the Arch of St. Severus built, which glorified his victories over the Parthians. On the other hand, his policies weighed heavily on the finances of the Reich. The increase in pay, the constant campaigns and the generous donations to the army devoured enormous sums. To cover the costs, he had to raise taxes and expand coinage, which contributed to inflation in the long run. Severus also attached great importance to law and administration. He had numerous legal treatises collected and promoted, which later formed an important basis of Roman law. Under his rule, important jurists such as Papinian, Ulpian, and Paul worked, whose works continued to have an impact in late antiquity and beyond into modern times. In this respect, Severus was not only a warrior, but also an emperor who strengthened the institutional base of the empire. His family, on the other hand, was to plunge the Reich into new conflicts. With his Syrian wife Julia Domna, he had 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, whom he included in the rule at an early age. However, both were filled with rivalry and hatred, and their shared legacy was to end in blood. Even during Severus' lifetime, it was noticeable that the brothers were not able to rule the empire in harmony. Severus himself is said to have advised them on his deathbed to make the soldiers rich and disregard the rest. This cynical sentence made it clear how much he had internalized the role of the military as the basis of power. When Severus died in Britain in 211, he left behind an empire that was outwardly stronger than before, but inwardly burdened by increasing dependence on the army and the neglect of the Senate. His policies had laid the foundations for the later crisis of the 3rd century. The army had become the decisive power, and the finances of the empire were strained. At the same time, however, he had secured the borders, strengthened the administration, and founded a dynasty that was to rule Rome for decades to come. Septimius Severus was an emperor of great energy and assertiveness. He knew how to gain the upper hand in the turmoil of the civil war, and he expanded his power with an iron fist. His reign was marked by military splendor, legal reform, and personal ambition. But it was also the beginning of a development that destroyed the balance between emperor, senate, and people and placed the empire in the hands of the army more than ever before. It showed the new reality of the Roman Empire. The emperor was no longer primarily the first citizen, but the supreme general, whose power rested on the sword. Chapter 35, Caracalla and Geta, brothers in deadly conflict. When Septimius Severus died in Eboracum in 211 AD, he left the Roman Empire to his 2 sons Caracalla and Geta. Even during the emperor's lifetime, it had become apparent that the brothers could not get along. Both were ambitious, of different characters, and characterized by an upbringing that took them more against each other than for each other. Severus had appointed them both Augusti, hoping that a joint rule would stabilize the empire. But this attempt was to fail. Instead of a shared power, a deadly contest began, plunging the empire into a time of intrigue, violence, and family tragedy. Caracalla, actually Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus, was the elder of the 2 brothers. He was of an impulsive, irascible nature, passionate and warlike. Geta, on the other hand, who was completely Publius Septimius Geta, was considered calmer, more level-headed, and more inclined to the arts and administration. Already in their youth they had competed for the favor of their parents, and this enmity intensified when they now had to share the highest power. After the death of their father, the brothers returned to Rome, accompanied by their mother Julia Domna, who hoped to ease the tensions. But instead of governing in joint responsibility, they tried to divide the palace and the affairs of government among themselves. It was said that they even divided the imperial apartments with walls so that they would not have to meet each other. The court was divided into 2 camps. The followers of Caracalla and the supporters of Geta were hostile to each other, and the atmosphere was one of suspicion and hatred. Caracalla now stood as an autocrat, but his victory was stained with blood from the beginning. In order to secure his power, he not only had Geta killed, but also systematically persecuted his followers. Tens of thousands of people are said to have been murdered in a veritable wave of purges, including senators, officers, and friends of Geta. Their memory was erased. Geta's name was no longer allowed to be mentioned, his pictures and statues were destroyed, his inscriptions were erased from the monuments. This procedure, the so-called damnatio memoriae, was supposed to erase Geta from history, but it was precisely this attempt that made the fratricide unforgettable. Regardless of this, it was an important step in the development of the empire, which thus defined itself more strongly as a unified whole. In Rome itself, Caracalla had magnificent buildings built to demonstrate his greatness. The most famous are the Baths of Caracalla, a monumental bathing and entertainment complex that could accommodate thousands of people. With their halls, gardens, swimming pools, and libraries, they were not only a place of personal hygiene, but also an expression of imperial generosity. To this day, they are a testimony to the architectural ambitions of the emperor, who, despite his cruelty, also wanted to present himself as a benefactor of the people. But Caracalla's personality was marked by cruelty and mistrust. He saw conspiracies everywhere and reacted with harshness. His paranoia led to constant executions and an atmosphere of fear. His relationship with the Senate was also marked by hostility. Like his father, he despised the old elites and relied almost exclusively on the army. This made him the darling of the soldiers, but to the terror of the civilian population and the political leadership. His end came abruptly. In 217 he was murdered by one of his officers during a campaign in Mesopotamia, probably on behalf of the Praetorian prefect Macrinus, who himself aspired to the throne. Caracalla died at the age of only 29, at the height of his power, but hated by many. His death sparked renewed unrest, and the empire entered a new phase of uncertainty. Thus, the reign of the two brothers, which was never really won, is considered one of the most tragic episodes of the Roman imperial period. It shows how the inner strife in the imperial family could shake the entire empire and how the insatiable greed for power tore even the bonds of blood. With Caracalla's death and the short-lived reign of Macrinus, a new phase marked by uncertainty began, which was to further weaken the Severan dynasty. With the death of Caracalla in 217 AD, the brutal rule of an emperor marked by cruelty and violence came to an abrupt end, who had inscribed himself in history through the murder of his brother Geta and through incessant wars. But the succession was not secured, and as so often in the Roman imperial period, it was not the will of the deceased ruler or the Senate that decided, but the power of the army. An intrigue immediately arose in the ranks of the praetorians and officers, and at the center was the man who was instrumental in Caracalla's death, Macrinus. Marcus Apellius Macrinus was not a member of the imperial family, not a general of long tradition, but rose from the knighthood. He was a lawyer and had served as Praetorian prefect before taking the decisive step. Since he had covered up the conspiracy against Caracalla, in which the emperor was murdered by an officer during a campaign against the Parthians, he took the opportunity and had himself proclaimed emperor by the troops. This made him the first emperor who did not come from the senatorial class, but exclusively from the knighthood. For many Romans, this was a breach of taboo, a sign that the traditional structures of the principate were continuing to disintegrate. Macrinus immediately tried to consolidate his position. He concluded a peace treaty with the Parthians to end the dangerous war that Caracalla had started. But this peace was bought at a high price. Rome had to evacuate territories and make high financial payments. For the army, which expected victories, this was a bitter defeat, and Macrinus' popularity suffered considerably. His attempts to cut salaries and reduce government spending also made him unpopular. Precisely because his power rested exclusively on the loyalty of the army, this policy was disastrous. While Macrinus tried to maintain control in Antioch, an uprising broke out in Syria, which started with the women of the Severan family. Julia Domna, the mother of Caracalla and Geta, had died shortly after the death of her son, but her sister Julia Misa stayed behind. She was an influential woman from Emesa in Syria, rich and ambitious, and she realized that the hour had come to bring the Severians back to the throne. She introduced her grandson, Varius Avitus Bassianus, better known as Elagabalus, to those around her. This young man, barely 14 years old, was the high priest of the sun god Elagabalus in Emesa. Julia Misa claimed that he was in fact the illegitimate son of Caracalla and thus the rightful heir to the throne. The Roman legions in Syria, dissatisfied with Macrinus, readily took up this claim. They longed for an emperor who would once again embody the traditions of the Severians and promise them generous rewards. In 218, Elagabalus was proclaimed by the troops, and soon he marched against Macrinus. In the Battle of Antioch, Macrinus was defeated. He tried to escape, but was captured and executed. This put an end to his short and unhappy reign, and the Severi returned in the guise of a youthful, inexperienced, but governed by powerful women. Elagabal's reign is one of the most bizarre and controversial episodes of the Roman imperial period. The young emperor, who bore the name of his god as an epithet, was characterized by religious exoticism and personal eccentricity from the very beginning. His sun god Elagabalus had been worshipped in Syria as a black meteorite, which was kept in a magnificent temple in Emesa. Elagabalus brought this cult to Rome and tried to make it the central religion of the empire. He had a new temple built on the Palatine Hill, where the stone was placed, and carried out magnificent rituals and processions that overshadowed the traditional Roman cults. For the conservative Romans, this was a sacrilege. The young emperor neglected the worship of the old gods, especially Jupiter, and instead relied on the foreign, oriental religion of his homeland. Even more outrageous was his behavior in public. Elagabalus appeared in extravagant robes, wore women's clothes, put on makeup and was celebrated as a divine priest in elaborate processions. He allegedly married the Vestal virgin Aquilia Severa, which caused a scandal because Vestal virgins were obliged to perpetual chastity. All this undermined his standing with the Roman elites and made him appear as a decadent, godless ruler. At the same time, he showed an enormous addiction to wastefulness. Elagabalus distributed riches to his followers, gave magnificent festivals and squandered money on temple buildings and cult celebrations. The people were fascinated by the spectacles, but the senators and soldiers, who felt increasingly neglected, viewed him with growing suspicion. Julia Maesa and her daughter Julia Soaemias, the mother of the young emperor, tried to support his rule by directing the administration and maintaining relations with the army. But even their power could not contain the discontent permanently. In the few years of his reign, Elagabalus did not succeed in stabilizing the empire. Instead, Rome witnessed an emperor who was more interested in religious rituals and personal exoticism than in politics or war. The old sources, which are characterized by a senatorial view, portray him as dissolute, eccentric, and incompetent. Certainly, they exaggerate some things in order to put him in a particularly negative light, but it remains undisputed that Elagabalus did not meet the expectations of a Roman emperor. With Severus Alexander, a new, albeit short, phase of stability began. But the Macrinus and Elagabalus episode clearly showed how fragile the empire had become. Intrigues, excesses, and religious experiments had shaken confidence in the institution. More than ever, the army decided who became emperor and who was overthrown. Rome was moving inexorably towards the great crisis of the 3rd century, in which the emperors were often only playthings of the legions. So Macrinus and Elagabalus remained two emperors who could hardly be more different. The sober jurist, who came to power through intrigue and lost it through unpopularity, and the eccentric priest-emperor, who overwhelmed Rome with his foreign cult. Both were transitional figures whose reign was short-lived, but they illustrated how unstable and unpredictable the Roman Empire had become during this period. Chapter 37. Severus Alexander and the Last Glimmer of Hope. When Elagabalus was murdered in 222 AD, the mood in the empire was tense and marked by deep uncertainty. The eccentric emperor had gambled away the trust of the elites and confused the people with his strange religious rituals, his dissolute lifestyle, and his disregard for Roman traditions. Now the family of Julia Maesa prevailed again, but this time with a candidate who was very different from the controversial priest-emperor. Severus Alexander, Elagabal's cousin, was proclaimed the new Augustus with the support of the Praetorians. His young age, his virtue, and the wise guidance of his mother and grandmother made him a beacon of hope at a time when Rome was in dire need of stability. Severus Alexander, whose full name was Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, was only about 13 years old when he accepted the purple. His young age meant that he could not run the rule independently. But Julia Maesa and later especially his mother Julia Mamaea made sure that he was surrounded by the best teachers and advisors. The idea was to present an emperor who was level-headed, virtuous, and dutiful, the perfect counterpart to Elagabalus. From the very beginning, efforts were made to shape his image, a pious, disciplined ruler who respected Roman traditions and took the needs of the empire seriously. The first years of his reign were marked by a return to order. Elagabal's foreign cults were banished from Rome, the black meteorite of the sun god was brought back to Emesa, and the old gods regained their ancestral worship. The Senate, which had been humiliated under Elagabalus, was once again more involved in politics. The people also experienced a period of calm as the wasteful excesses of the past ended. The young figure of the emperor, accompanied by his virtuous mother, seemed like a moral new beginning. But the empire was in a difficult situation. New dangers arose at the borders, which were to prove to be increasingly threatening. In the east, the Parthian Empire had been replaced by a new power, the Sassanids. Under Ardashir I, an aggressive Persian kingdom arose, which took far more energetic action against Rome than the ancient Parthians. Ardashir claimed control over all former Achaemenid territories, openly questioning Roman control over Mesopotamia and Armenia. As early as 230, he began to invade Roman territory and threaten Syria. Severus Alexander, who had little experience in military matters, had to act. Under the influence of his advisors and his mother, he prepared a major campaign. In 231 he moved east and gathered his armies in Anch. But the campaign was disappointing. Although the Romans tried several offensives, they lacked determination and clear leadership. The legions suffered from disease and supply problems, and in the end Alexander was able to prevent the Persians from penetrating deep into the empire, but a decisive victory failed to materialize. The war ended in an uncertain armistice, and Rome's prestige was severely shaken. No sooner had the danger in the east been averted than a new crisis flared up on the northern border. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and threatened Gaul. Again, Alexander moved forward with his mother and his farm to stabilize the situation. But here, too, his military inexperience became apparent. Instead of leading the troops into a decisive battle, he favored negotiations and tried to pacify the tribes through gifts and treaties. For the Roman legions, who were accustomed to enforcing respect through strength and discipline, this behavior was a sign of weakness. They despised the young emperor and accused him of cowardice. The relationship between Severus Alexander and his soldiers deteriorated rapidly. The legionnaires, who were already dissatisfied with the long presence of the imperial family in the camp, felt humiliated by an emperor who did not appreciate their harshness and willingness to make sacrifices. Many officers also distrusted the dominance of Julia Mamaea, who had too much influence in the eyes of the army and determined her son's decisions. The soldiers wanted an energetic general, not a philosopher emperor led by his mother. Severus Alexander is remembered in history as a tragic emperor. He was young, well-educated, marked by virtue and morality, but he was at the head of the empire at a time that demanded strength and determination. His consideration, his inclination to negotiate and his dependence on his mother made him unsuitable in the eyes of the soldiers. Yet he was perhaps one of the few emperors who honestly had the well-being of the people in mind. His efforts to build peace, improve administration, and restore religious order show that he was not a bad person, but he was too weak as a ruler in a time of growing crisis. Thus, Severus Alexander was not only the last emperor of the Severi, but also the last to try to rule with virtue and reason. Its tragic end marked the transition from the relative stability of the high emperor period to the chaotic era of the soldier emperors. His name remained in the memory of many contemporaries as a symbol of a missed opportunity, a young ruler who could have renewed the empire if the times had given him the opportunity. But history had changed, and Rome entered a darker phase of its existence. When Severus Alexander was overthrown in the field camp in Mainz by the discontent of the legions, the soldiers elected Maximinus as their new Augustus. This was the first time in history that a man had become emperor who had no connection to the Senate and ruled solely through military loyalty. For the senators in Rome, this was a shock, a break with the principles that Augustus had once established. But for the soldiers, Maximinus was a man from their ranks, one who shared their hardships and spoke their language. At the same time, his relationship with the Senate deteriorated dramatically. Maximinus despised the senators, who in turn saw him as a barbaric upstart. He ignored their advice, had many of them executed, and ruled solely by the power of the military. This was unbearable for the Roman elite, and resistance soon formed. Especially in Africa, there was an uprising, which was supported by the so-called Gordian emperors. In 238, the governors of Africa rose up and proclaimed Gordian I and his son Gordian II emperors. They were respected senators and were intended to be an alternative to Maximinus. The Senate in Rome joined this uprising and declared Maximinus an enemy of the state. For a moment, it seemed as if the old order could be restored. But the reality was different. Gordian II soon fell in battle against loyal troops, and his father committed suicide. This collapsed the uprising in Africa. The city defended itself valiantly, and Maximinus' troops suffered from hunger and disease. The soldiers, who had been loyal until then, began to become dissatisfied. They saw that the campaign had stalled and that Maximinus had put them in a hopeless situation. Finally, they turned against him. In the spring of 238, soldiers broke into his tent and murdered him along with his son. His head was sent to Rome to convince the Senate of his death. The fall of Maximinus marked the end of a reign that had lasted only 3 years, but was of great symbolic importance. He had been the first soldier emperor, and with him an era had begun in which the fate of the empire was determined almost exclusively by the whims and loyalties of the army. The Senate had once again tried to gain influence, but the following decades would show that the real power lay with the legions. The year 238 AD went down in history as the so-called Year of the Six Emperors, a year marked by chaos, rivalries, and power struggles. It began with the fall and death of Maximinus Thrax, the gigantic soldier emperor who had challenged the resistance of the elites through his harshness and contempt for the Senate. In these uncertain times, the Senate desperately grasped at every opportunity to preserve the old order and to bring itself into play as a decisive institution. The focus was on the Gordian emperors, who ruled only for a short time, but were nevertheless a symbol of the Senate's attempt to regain influence in the empire. The first step towards this happened in Africa. There, in the spring of 238, the governors of the province rose up against Maximinus. They were dissatisfied with the oppressive tax demands and the harsh rule and looked for an alternative. They turned to Gordian I, an elderly senator of high standing, who had led a quiet life in his hometown of Carthage. Gordian was already over 80 years old, but his name and reputation made him attractive to the rebels. Together with his son Gordian II, he reluctantly accepted the imperial dignity. The people of Africa welcomed the new emperors with enthusiasm. Soon the news reached Rome, where the Senate, relieved by an alternative to Maximinus, recognized the Gordians. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old cooperation between the Senate and the Kaiser could be revived. But the happiness did not last long. Nearby was the governor of Numidia, a loyal follower of Maximinus, who had experienced legions at his disposal. He marched against Carthage, and Gordian II was killed in the battle, while his father took his own life in despair. After only 22 days, the rule of the two Gordians ended, and the dream of the Senate seemed to be destroyed once again. But the Senate was not prepared to surrender to Maximinus. In his desperation, he elected 2 of his own members, Pupienus and Balbinus, as emperors. This election reflected an attempt to bring imperial power back under senatorial control. Pupienus was considered an experienced general, Balbinus an educated statesman. Together, they were supposed to protect Rome from the return of the Maximinus. At the same time, the Senate elevated Gordian III's grandson Gordian I to Caesar in order to maintain the connection to the popular family and to secure the support of the people. Meanwhile, Maximinus Thrax marched with his army to Italy to put down the uprising. He besieged Aquileia, but the city stubbornly resisted. Hunger and disease broke out in the army, and morale sank. Finally, the soldiers rose up against Maximinus, murdered him and his son, and sent their heads to Rome. This was a triumph for the Senate. The dangerous enemy had fallen, and the rule seemed to be in his hands. But the joy was short-lived. Pupienus and Balbinus proved to be incompatible. Their rivalry paralyzed the government, and they had great difficulty winning the favor of the Praetorian Guard. She was dissatisfied anyway, as she felt ignored by the decisions of the Senate. As tensions grew, a dramatic event occurred. In the summer of 238, the Praetorian Guard stormed the palace, seized Pupienus and Balbinus, and brutally murdered them. In her place, she elevated the young Gordian III, then barely 13 years old, to Augustus. This meant that the Senate was once again pushed to the margins, and the real power once again lay with the soldiers. But Gordian III was a beacon of hope. His young age and name gave him popularity, and many people associated him with the hope of a return of the stable Severa period. Of course, he could not conduct government business himself. His mother and influential advisors, especially the Praetorian prefect Time Scythius, took over the leadership. Under her leadership, the empire experienced a brief phase of relative order. Gordian III soon faced one of the greatest challenges of his time, the Persian War. The newly founded Sassanid Empire under Shapur I was determined to change the balance of power in the east. It attacked the Roman provinces in Mesopotamia and threatened Syria. Gordian III moved east in 242 and led a successful campaign with the support of Time Scythius. The Romans won victories, and the young emperor gained prestige. But in the middle of the campaign, Time Scythius died suddenly, possibly poisoned. Without his clever mentor, Gordian was helpless, and his new Praetorian prefect, Philippus Arabs, took advantage of the situation. In 244, a catastrophe occurred in Mesopotamia. The Romans suffered a heavy defeat at Missish against the Persians, and Gordian III died under unexplained circumstances. Some sources claim that he was killed in battle, others that Philip had him murdered. In any case, he was declared a god after his death, and his popularity was remembered. The Gordian emperors and the dramatic events of 238 show the whole fragility of the Roman Empire at this time. The Senate tried to play a role by elevating men from its ranks to the throne. But he did not have the military power to enforce his decisions. In the end, the army always decided, and the Praetorian Guard in Rome showed once again that it could decide on the life and death of the emperors. Chapter 40. Philip of the Arab and the Millennial Celebration of Rome. After the death of Gordian III in 244 AD, the Roman Empire was once again at a turning point. The circumstances of its end remain in the dark to this day. Some sources claim that he was killed in a battle against the Persians, others blame the new strongman in the army, Philippus Arabs, who allegedly had a hand in it. The only thing that is certain is that Philip, who had previously served as Praetorian prefect, was proclaimed emperor and continued the troubled times in which generals came to power through the favor of the military. With his rise, the cycle of hope, violence, and intrigue that shook the empire in the 3rd century continued. But the shiny surface was deceptive. Behind the celebrations, the situation remained tense. The borders of the empire were threatened, especially on the Rhine and Danube, where Germanic tribes broke in again and again. Philip had to lead campaigns to push back the invaders. Although he achieved some successes, the constant danger showed how fragile stability had become. In addition, his origin and his seizure of power by the army earned him mistrust in the Senate. Many senators did not see him as a legitimate emperor, but as an upstart who had risen to the top through intrigue. The overthrow of Philip the Arab ended a rule that had begun with great hopes, but ultimately failed to solve the fundamental problems of the empire. The 1,000-year celebration of Rome, which he had staged with so much splendor, proved to be a deceptive spectacle behind which the growing tensions remained hidden. Instead of stability, his government brought only a brief reprieve before the empire was once again plunged into civil wars and invasions. In 250, Decius issued an edict that is considered in history to be the first systematic attempt to suppress Christianity throughout the empire. Every citizen, regardless of their origin, had to make a sacrifice to the Roman gods and the emperor before the authorities. A written certificate, the so-called libellus, was issued for the implementation, which served as proof. Those who refused were tortured, thrown into prison, or executed. This began a wave of persecutions that shook the entire empire. Many Christians were now faced with the most difficult decision of their lives: either remain faithful to the faith and risk death, or make the sacrifice and burden their conscience. Some were intimidated and sacrificed to survive, others bought false certificates. But many held out and suffered martyrdom. Numerous executions took place, especially in North Africa and Egypt. Bishops, priests, and ordinary believers died for their faith and were venerated as martyrs by their communities. Among them was the Roman bishop Fabianus, who was executed during this persecution. Meanwhile, Decius also had to act at the borders, because the threats from outside were increasing. On the Rhine and Danube, Germanic tribes increasingly invaded Roman territory. The situation became particularly dangerous when the Goths under their king Cniva crossed the Danube and penetrated deep into the provinces. They plundered cities, besieged Philippopolis in Thrace, and threatened the order of the entire Balkans. The death of the emperor on the battlefield was a drastic event. He was the first Roman emperor to fall in battle against external enemies, and this shook the empire to the core. The defeat of Abritus was not only a military setback, but also a symbol of the weakness of the empire in this era. The emperor, who wanted to restore Rome to its former strength, had sunk in the morass of the Balkan front, and his death left behind a power vacuum that created new uncertainty. Decius's reign was short-lived, but its effects were lasting. His persecution of Christians had hit the church hard, but it survived and emerged stronger. The martyrs became role models, and the memory of their suffering strengthened the faith of many communities. What Decius wanted to destroy, he ultimately unintentionally contributed to consolidating. His attempt to renew Roman religion and morality failed because time had changed. The old unity that Rome had once supported could no longer be restored. The provinces were more diverse, Christianity continued to grow, and the borders were under constant pressure. Decius presided over an empire that had become too complex and fragile to be saved by the means of the past. After the tragic deaths of Emperor Decius and his son Herennius Etruscus at the Battle of Abritus in 251 AD, the Roman Empire was once again in a period of uncertainty. The Goths had won a crushing victory, and for the first time in history, an emperor had been killed on the battlefield by external enemies. This event shook confidence in the strength of Rome and showed how dangerous the barbarian tribes on the borders had become. In the midst of this crisis, the legions elevated Trebonianus Gallus to emperor, a senator and military man who had survived the Abritus disaster. His rule, as well as that of his successor Aemilianus, was to be marked by the constant threat of the Goths and the inability to stabilize the empire permanently. The Goths, strengthened by their victory, continued to penetrate the Balkan provinces. Gallus did not see himself in a position to give a decisive military response. Instead, he made a treaty with the Goths that promised them annual payments to curb their attacks. This policy of tribute was unusual for Rome and was perceived by many as a sign of weakness. Although it provided short-term calm, it also encouraged the Goths to increase their demands and showed other tribes that Rome had become susceptible to blackmail. In addition to external threats, the empire also suffered from internal crises. A devastating plague, possibly the so-called Cyprian plague, spread through the provinces and claimed countless victims. Cities were depopulated, fields lay fallow, and the economy began to falter. The combination of disease, invasions, and financial burdens brought society to the brink of collapse. Gallus' government seemed powerless in this situation. The course of persecution also continued in religious terms. Christians, who had already suffered greatly under Decius, were again targeted. Gallus ordered further measures against them, partly for fear that they might provoke the wrath of the gods by rejecting the state cults. But the persecutions remained uncoordinated and could not stop the growth of the church. Rather, the suffering of many congregations led to the renewed strengthening of the martyr cult and strengthened the inner unity of Christianity. The decisive turning point came when the Goths continued their raids despite the agreed payments. They penetrated deep into Asia Minor, plundered cities and threatened shipping in the Black Sea. Gallus, who did not have the necessary authority to discipline the troops and lead a successful campaign, increasingly lost the confidence of the army. In this situation, Aemilianus, the governor of Moesia, appeared. He led the legions stationed there to a surprising victory against the Goths and temporarily drove them out of Roman territory. This success made him a hero in the eyes of his soldiers. The troops proclaimed him emperor, and Aemilianus marched to Italy to contest Gallus' rule. Gallus tried to assert himself with the help of Valerian, the governor of the Germanic provinces, but before reinforcements arrived, he was murdered by his own soldiers. His reign ended after only 2 years, another example of the powerlessness of the emperors of this era, who could not prevail in the long run against the claims of their own armies. Aemilianus initially seemed to be the savior of the empire. His victory over the Goths had shown that decisive action could bring success. He presented himself as an energetic general who wanted to defend the borders and lead Rome back to strength. The Senate recognized him, albeit reluctantly, and for a brief moment it seemed as if he could stabilize the situation. But the reality was merciless. While Aemilianus was still consolidating his position, the legions in Germania elevated their own commander Valerian to emperor. He was an experienced statesman who, unlike Aemilianus, was able to rely on broad support. When Valerian moved his troops to Italy, the loyalty of Aemilianus' soldiers waned. Even before it came to a decisive battle, he was murdered by his own men. His reign had lasted barely 3 months, another short and bloody chapter in the long line of soldier emperors. The episode about Gallus and Aemilianus exemplifies the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors were no longer made in Rome, but at the borders, in the camp. Their legitimacy was not based on tradition or recognition by the Senate, but on immediate success in the fight against the enemy. Those who won could put on the purple, but those who failed or even hesitated were quickly dropped. The loyalty of the army was fleeting, and the empire staggered from one usurpation to the next. At the same time, this period shows how great the threat to the Goths had become. They were no longer occasional predators, but developed into a serious force that threatened entire provinces and even dominated the Black Sea. The payments made by Rome and the repeated defeats made it clear that the empire no longer possessed the undisputed supremacy it once held. For the population, this era meant constant uncertainty. Farmers fled the invasions, cities were plundered, and epidemics depopulated entire regions. Trust in imperial power waned, and in this atmosphere many people sought solace in religion, whether in the traditional cults or, increasingly, in Christianity, which continued to grow despite persecution. Gallus and Aemilianus were not weak men, but they faced a problem far greater than their individual ability. They tried to create peace in the short term, be it through tributes or military victories, but the foundation of the empire crumbled. Their rapid falls made it clear that the empire had become a plaything of events in this era, depending on the whims of the legions and the blows of the enemies. With Valerian, a man who was more energetic and experienced appeared on stage after them, but he too was soon to feel the limits of his power. The 3rd century demanded more than individual personalities could achieve. It was an epoch in which the structures themselves disintegrated, and every emperor, whether strong or weak, was caught up in the maelstrom of crisis. Chapter 43. Valerian and Gallienus, father and son in the face of catastrophe. With the rise of Valerian in 253 AD, the Roman Empire seemed to have a ruler who could be able to cope with the ongoing crisis. Valerian was not a youthful upstart, not a short-lived usurper, but an experienced senator who had held important offices for decades. He was governor, military leader, and politically savvy. Many saw him as a man of the old school who could restore the dignity and authority of the empire. But the burden that rested on his shoulders was crushing. The empire found itself in a maelstrom of external threats, internal revolts, epidemics, and economic weakness. Even a capable man like Valerian could not stop the catastrophe, and his reign was to end in unprecedented drama. Valerian came from a distinguished family and had a long career behind him when the legions proclaimed him emperor. He knew of the impossibility of ruling the empire alone, and therefore immediately elevated his son Gallienus to co-emperor. This created a common rule based on the division of labor. Valerian took over the east, where the Persians under Shapur I posed an increasing threat, while Gallienus was to secure control of Gaul, Italy, and the Danube border in the west. Father and son thus formed a dual empire that initially promised stability. Gallienus, born about 218, was younger and of a very different nature from his father. While Valerian was considered serious and tradition-conscious, Gallienus was inclined towards philosophy, art, and intellectuality. He was a man who adorned himself with Greek education and cultivated a rather cosmopolitan lifestyle. But his determination was often underestimated, which, despite all the difficulties, was to make him one of the longest reigning emperors of the 3rd century. The threats they faced were enormous. In the east, Shapur I, the powerful king of the Sassanids, had attacked Mesopotamia and conquered Roman cities. In the west, Germanic tribes pressed the Rhine and Danube borders, while at the same time local usurpers appeared in Africa and Asia Minor. The administration was overwhelmed, the finances were exhausted, and an epidemic further weakened the population. When Gallienus was assassinated in Milan in 268 AD, the Roman Empire was exhausted by decades of uninterrupted crises. The borders in the north and east were under pressure, usurpers and special empires had formed inside, and confidence in the empire was shaken by the constant succession of intrigues and defeats. In this situation, the officers of the army raised a new emperor, Marcus Aurelius Claudius, who would later go down in history under the epithet Claudius Gothicus. With him, a short but decisive phase began, in which Rome gave the impression for a moment that it could free itself from the maelstrom of catastrophes. Posterity remembered him with respect. Unlike many of his predecessors, he was not a tyrant, a bloodthirsty ruler, or a weak failure, but an emperor who fulfilled his office with dignity and did not fail at the decisive moment. His name, Gothicus, remained a badge of honor that showed that Rome could still win. So Claudius Gothicus remains an emperor who shone like a light in a dark epoch, but was extinguished too soon. If he had lived longer, it might have been possible to at least mitigate the crisis. But the story took a different course, and after him new turmoil followed, until finally Aurelian took the reins in his hands and put the realm back together again for a short time with iron energy. Claudius' victory over the Goths was the prelude to this, but he himself could not reap the rewards. Chapter 45: Aurelian, the Iron Savior of the Empire. Aurelian came from a poor background in Illyria, the region that repeatedly produced outstanding military leaders during this era. He joined the army as a young man and made a career through bravery and severity. His reputation was that of an uncompromising disciplinarian who tolerated no negligence and always fought on the front line in battles. This earned him the unconditional loyalty of his soldiers, but also the reputation of a tough, even merciless general. When he was proclaimed emperor by the legions after Claudius' death, many saw him as the only man who could save the empire from its despair. No sooner had he taken over the reign than the challenges assailed him. The Goths were still a threat, and riots broke out in Italy. Aurelian reacted with iron severity. He put down uprisings, restored order, and led the army back to the Balkans with discipline, where he decisively defeated the Goths. Many of them were accepted into the empire as federates, but on the clear condition that they would serve Rome in the future. This victory stabilized the Danube border and showed that the new emperor knew no hesitation. The threat came from within. There had been repeated famines and unrest in Rome. To protect the capital from future attacks, Aurelian had a massive structure built, the Aurelian Wall. This fortification system enclosed the entire city and was intended to secure it against barbarian incursions, which had become a real danger in the meantime. The wall was an admission that even Rome, the eternal city, was no longer sacrosanct. At the same time, it was a symbol of Aurelian's pragmatism. He knew that defense was just as important as offense. After Italy was secured, he turned to the east. There, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra had created an empire that almost seemed like a new empire. With intelligence, charisma, and determination, she had taken over the reign after the death of her husband and had risen to become ruler over large areas. It controlled Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome, and thus cut off the capital from vital grain supplies. Zenobia was revered in the east and staged herself as a descendant of the Ptolemies and Cleopatras. For Rome, it was a challenge that Aurelian could not tolerate. In 272, Aurelian marched against Palmyra. His campaigns were hard and uncompromising. First he liberated Egypt from the Palmyrene troops, then he moved to Syria. At Emei and later at Emesa, decisive battles took place, in which Aurelian's cavalry defeated the enemy. Finally, he besieged Palmyra himself. Zenobia, who tried to seek help from the Persians, was captured while fleeing. The city surrendered, and Aurelian spared it for the time being. But soon the Palmyrenes rose again, and this time Aurelian reacted without mercy. He had Palmyra destroyed, his treasures brought to Rome, and the city robbed of its importance. Zenobia was taken as a prisoner to Rome, where she supposedly appeared in a triumphal procession, adorned with golden chains that turned her dignity into humiliation. The Palmyrene Empire was thus extinguished, and Rome had regained its supremacy in the east. No sooner had Aurelian pacified the east than he turned to the west. The Gallic Empire, which included Gaul, Spain, and Britain, was under the rule of Tetricus. Here, too, Aurelian showed his energy. In 274 he led his armies against Tetricus and met him at Chalons in a great battle. The Gaul was defeated, supposedly after secretly surrendering to Aurelian's mercy to escape pressure from his own soldiers. With this victory, the empire was united again. For the first time in decades, all provinces were under Roman control again. For this achievement, Aurelian was given the nickname Restitutor Orbis. He celebrated a triumphal procession in Rome that could hardly be surpassed in splendor. Zenobia and Tetricus were paraded as prisoners. Exotic animals and treasures from all over the world roamed the streets, and the people cheered the man who had reunited the empire. But Aurelian did not think only militarily. He also tried to strengthen the religious and ideological unity of the empire. In particular, he promoted the cult of the Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. He built a magnificent temple in Rome and presented himself as the chosen ruler of this god. At a time when many old ties were crumbling, This sun cult was supposed to be an overarching bond that held the realm together. Some historians see Aurelian's sun cult as a forerunner of the later turn to Christianity, as it emphasized the idea of a universal deity. His reforms also reached into the administration and economy. Aurelian tried to stabilize coinage and fight corruption. He strengthened Rome's grain supply and introduced price measures to satisfy the population. But his strictness also made him enemies. In 275, he fell victim to an intrigue. Court officials, who felt threatened by his harshness, conspired against him and murdered him during a campaign against new threats in the east. His death was a shock, because he had just reunited the empire and laid the foundations for stabilization. Without his energy, much of what he had built up fell apart again. Despite his violent end, Aurelian remains one of the outstanding figures of the Roman imperial period. In an era of chaos, he succeeded in reuniting the empire with an iron fist, defeating internal and external enemies, and renewing the empire for a moment. His epithet Restitutor Orbis was not an empty phrase, but a recognition of his tremendous achievement. Posterity remembered him as the last truly great soldier emperor whose determination and energy rebuilt the empire. If he had been granted more time, he might have been able to create a permanent renewal. But even so, it remains proof that Rome in the 3rd century was not only marked by decline, but also produced men who could save the empire, even if only for a short span. Chapter 46. Probus and the last successes of the Illyrian emperors. After the assassination of Aurelian in 275, the Roman Empire was once again without a clear leader. His energetic regiment had restored unity, but his sudden death showed how fragile the stabilization was. Several successors, including Tacitus and Florianus, tried to preserve the legacy, but their reigns were short and marked by uncertainty. It was not until Marcus Aurelius Probus, another emperor from the Illyrian provinces, that the empire received a ruler who acted with energy, and a spirit of reform. Probus was not as famous as Aurelian, but his reign is considered one of the last phases in which Rome experienced a respite and visible successes in the 3rd century. Probus was born around 232 in Sirmium, a city that became a center of Illyrian imperial figures. Like many of his compatriots, he was a soldier from his youth and made a name for himself in the army through bravery, discipline, and clever leadership. He held important commands under Aurelian and other emperors until the legions proclaimed him emperor in 276 after the fall of Florianus. The Senate confirmed his election, and so he took office at a time when Rome was still threatened on all fronts. His first task was to secure the borders. In the west, the Germanic tribes again threatened Gaul, while the Goths and Sarmatians were active on the Danube. Probus proved to be a brilliant general. With quick, targeted campaigns, he pushed back the invaders and won several victories that earned him recognition. Especially in Gaul, he restored order by not only defeating the enemies, but also rebuilding the destroyed cities. His goal was not only to win militarily, but also to stabilize the infrastructure. A notable aspect of his policy was dealing with defeated barbarians. Probus did not rely solely on extermination, but on integration. He settled many captive Germanic tribes and other tribes within the empire and turned them into farmers or soldiers. This measure had a double benefit. On the one hand, depopulated agriculture was revived, and on the other hand, the empire gained urgently needed workers and fighters. Although this policy was also intended to create problems in the long term, as the barbarians preserved their identity and later came into conflict with Rome, it stabilized many regions in the short term. Probus also intervened energetically in Egypt. There had been unrest there, which threatened Rome's grain supply. Probus led his army into the provinces, put down the uprisings and restored order. In doing so, he secured the vital grain supplies to the capital and underlined the central importance of Egypt for the survival of the empire. But Probus was not only a warrior, but also a reformer. He recognized that the Roman economy and agriculture were severely damaged by the constant wars and epidemics. Therefore, he did not let soldiers remain idle in the camps in peacetime, but used them for reconstruction. They planted vineyards, drained swamps, paved roads, and built defensive structures. This brought him recognition as a pioneer, but also resentment, as many soldiers found the hard work humiliating. Another major project was the securing of the borders by means of fortifications. Probus had defensive lines built on the Rhine and Danube and strengthened the fortifications in the provinces. These measures were intended to prevent enemies from entering the empire unhindered, and they laid the foundations for later systems, which were further expanded under Diocletian and Constantine. Religiously and ideologically, Probus followed the traditions of Aurelian. He also promoted the sun cult, which was to serve as a unifying bond in the multi-ethnic empire. Coins often show him in connection with Sol Invictus, and he portrayed himself as a ruler favored by the sun. This gave his rule a religious legitimacy that was urgently needed in the torn times. The successes of his campaigns and reforms made Probus popular, but his rule was not without difficulties. Again and again, usurpers rose up, supported by parts of the army or the provinces. Probus had to fight rivals several times, including Saturninus in Syria and Proculus in Gaul. Each time he prevailed, but the constant repetition of such uprisings showed how fragile loyalty had remained in the empire. A particularly serious problem was the attitude of the soldiers themselves. Probus' strict discipline and his compulsion to use them to work in peacetime led to growing discontent. What the emperor understood as a clever use of manpower, the legionnaires felt as an imposition. They were warriors, not farmers or construction workers, and they saw it as humiliation to plant vineyards or build roads. In the end, it was precisely this circumstance that cost Probus his life. In 282, he was with his troops in Sirmium, his hometown, and planned new campaigns against the Persians. But the soldiers' dissatisfaction escalated. In an uprising, they murdered the emperor, allegedly while he was supervising work on a drainage project. His death was tragic, because he did not fall at the hands of enemies, but at the hands of his own army, which had had enough of its severity. Posterity remembered Probus as one of the most capable rulers of the 3rd century. He was a disciplined general, a skillful administrator, and a man who sought solutions both militarily and economically. Under his rule, the empire experienced a rare period of stability, in which the borders were secured, the provinces pacified, and the economy revived. But his end also showed the limits of these successes. Even the most capable emperor was at the mercy of the whims of the soldiers in this era. Probus is thus remembered as an emperor who rebuilt the empire, won victories, secured provinces, and wanted to lay the foundations for stability with clever measures. But he was ahead of his time. His ideas about using the army for reconstruction were modern, but they met with resistance from those who were supposed to implement them. In the end, he became a victim of the same soldiers he had disciplined. His reign was a ray of hope in the dark 3rd century, proof that Rome still produced capable men, but at the same time a symbol of the insoluble tensions of that era. Diocletian came from Dalmatia, a part of the Illyrian provinces, which produced numerous capable emperors during this time. His origins were modest. He probably came from a family of humble origin, and yet he made a career in the army. As commander of the imperial bodyguard, he won the trust of his soldiers and was elevated to Augustus by them after the death of Emperor Numerianus. From the very beginning, he showed that he did not want to be a transitional emperor, but a man of vision, ready to redefine the empire. This event had enormous symbolic significance. Constantine, the victor in the sign of the cross, began from then on to openly promote Christianity. Although he himself had probably not yet been fully baptized, he saw in the new faith a power that could unite the kingdom. As early as 313, together with his co-emperor Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted Christians the freedom to practice their religion. This ended the great persecutions that had reached their peak under Diocletian. For the first time, Christianity was not only tolerated, but also recognized by the state. To end this controversy, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, the first ecumenical council of Christianity. Bishops from all over the empire came together, and under the chairmanship of the emperor the creed was formulated, which established the essential unity of Father and Son. In this way, Constantine created the basis for a uniform doctrine, which at the same time formed the foundation of the Orthodox Church. The emperor thus became an arbiter in theological questions, which meant a completely new connection between state and church. In addition to his religious politics, Constantine was also an important military ruler. After the victory over Maxentius, he turned against Licinius, who ruled the east. In several campaigns, he finally defeated him in 324 and became the sole ruler of the entire empire. This ended the era of the Tetrarchy, and Constantine ruled as the sovereign emperor. One of his most momentous decisions was the establishment of a new capital. Rome, the old center, was no longer ideal politically and strategically. Instead, Constantine chose Byzantium on the Bosporus, which he had magnificently expanded and renamed Constantinople. This city was located at the interface between Europe and Asia, had access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and was easier to defend against attacks. It was solemnly inaugurated in 330 and was to remain the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over a millennium. Constantine's rule was not free of harshness. He was not afraid to eliminate rivals, even within his family. His son Crispus was executed, as was his wife Fausta, reasons that remain obscure but testify to power struggles and intrigues. Despite these dark sides, his legacy remains enormous. Posterity saw in him the first Christian emperor, the man who put the cross on the banners of the empire and ushered in a new era. His name was venerated by the church, and he was even considered a saint in some traditions. At the same time, he was a brilliant statesman who reorganized the empire, created a new capital and laid the foundation for the Byzantine Empire. His death in 337 left behind an empire that was stronger than when he came to power, but also marked by the tensions that his reforms had brought. His sons succeeded him, but no dynasty was able to fully continue their father's greatness. Nevertheless, Constantine is remembered as the one who led the empire into a new epoch, the era of the Christian Empire and the Byzantine legacy. Chapter 49. The Divided Empire and the Slow Decline of the West. When Constantine the Great died in 337, he left behind an empire that was in some ways stronger than ever before, but at the same time riddled with tensions that were to have dramatic effects in the centuries to come. His reforms had consolidated Christianity, founded a new capital and restructured the administration. But the size and diversity of the empire could hardly be ruled by one hand. Already at his death, it became clear that the empire could disintegrate if the succession was not clearly regulated. Constantine's three sons divided the empire among themselves, a process that anticipated the later division into East and West. The division led to rivalries and wars. Constantine II, Constans and Constantius II each tried to expand their power. Intrigues, mistrust and violence characterized this phase. Soon two brothers were eliminated, so that Constantius II became the sole ruler. But the lesson was clear. An empire of this size could hardly be divided without tension, and yet division was inevitable. The distances were too great, the challenges at the borders too diverse. While the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital Constantinople, remained more stable over the centuries, a slow but steady decline began in the West. Several factors contributed to this. On the one hand, the economic focus shifted more and more to the east. The rich provinces in Asia Minor, Syria and Egypt supplied the empire with grain and tax revenues, while the western territories became impoverished. On the other hand, the east was better protected against invasions by the strong capital Constantinople, while the west remained threatened by the Rhine, Danube and the long Mediterranean coast. In the 4th century, new dangers appeared. The migration began, driven by the Huns, who pushed westwards from the depths of Asia. Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals and Alans were thus set in motion and sought protection within the borders of the empire. Initially, they were settled as federates, but their integration was incomplete. Tensions arose again and again, which finally ended in open conflicts. A key moment was the Battle of Adrianople in 378. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens opposed the Goths, who had crossed the Danube in large numbers after an uprising against mistreatment by Roman officials. In the sweltering heat of an Augustan plain, the Romans threw themselves into battle, and were devastatingly defeated. Valens himself fell, and 2/3 of his army was wiped out. This victory of the Goths was a shock for the Roman world. For the first time, it became clear that the legions were no longer invincible. After Adrianople, the integration of the barbarians became a question of survival for the empire. Theodosius the Great, the last emperor to rule both halves of the empire, tried to find a solution by ceding settlement areas in the empire to the Goths. They were given land and were allowed to keep their own leaders. In return, they were to serve Rome militarily. This created a new form of dependency that undermined traditional control. Theodosius was able to stabilize the empire once again, but after his death in 395 he finally divided it between his sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This time, the division was permanent. The east survived and developed into the Byzantine Empire, while the west sank into a maelstrom of invasions, usurpations, and economic decay. Rome itself lost importance. The emperors usually resided in Milan or Ravenna, better protected and closer to the threatened borders. In the west, the problems intensified. Germanic peoples traversed the provinces, plundered cities, and established their own kingdoms. In 410, the unimaginable happened. Rome itself was plundered by the Visigoths under Alaric. The Eternal City, which had been considered inviolable for centuries, was desecrated. For contemporaries, this was the end of the world, a sign that the old order had disintegrated. Although the city recovered, its splendor was irretrievably lost. Meanwhile, the administration sank into chaos. Emperors were controlled by generals, who were often of Germanic origin. One of the most influential figures of this time was Stilicho, a Vandal in the service of Rome, who exercised the real power as a general master. He defended the empire skillfully, but fell victim to intrigues and was executed. With his death, an important pillar collapsed, and the decline accelerated. Another drastic event was the migration of the Vandals to North Africa. Under Genseric, they crossed the Mediterranean in 429 and conquered Carthage, the breadbasket of the West. Rome thus lost not only one of its most important provinces, but also control over the western Mediterranean. The Vandals built up a fleet and threatened Italy themselves. In 455 they sacked Rome, and this time the destruction lasted a whole 2 weeks. The last decades of the Western Roman Empire were marked by a bitter struggle for survival. Emperors came and went, often puppets of the military masters, who in reality exercised power. Odoacer, a Germanic officer, finally deposed the last Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476. This act is traditionally considered the end of the Western Roman Empire, even if the reality was more complex. The East continued to exist, and the Germanic kingdoms that now emerged often saw themselves as heirs to Rome. The slow decline of the West was not a sudden collapse, but a centuries-long process. Economic weakness, internal instability, military overload, and the integration of foreign peoples undermined the structures until the empire no longer existed as an independent power. But his legacy remained alive, in the church, in the law, in the cities and streets that the Germanic successors continued to use. Thus, the history of the West ended in a mixture of tragedy and transformation. While Constantinople continued to flourish in the East for almost 1,000 years, political unity disappeared in the West, but not the idea of Rome. For many, the empire was immortal, even if its forms changed. The fall was also the beginning of a new era, the Middle Ages, which arose on the ruins of the empire. Chapter 50. The Heritage of Rome and the Birth of Europe. When the last Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by Odoacer in 476 AD, it was a symbolic act that marked the end of an era. But the fall of the Western Roman Empire did not mean the disappearance of Rome. Rather, a slow, profound change began, from which the medieval world and finally modern Europe developed. Rome's heritage has been preserved in many forms, in the institutions, in the law, in the religion, in the language, and in the cultural identity that has been formed over the centuries. At first, the idea of Rome remained alive. Odoacer himself, the Germanic commander who had deposed Romulus Augustulus, did not see himself as a destroyer, but as an administrator in the name of the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. The Germanic kingdoms that formed in Gaul, Spain, or Italy also invoked Roman traditions. The Goths took over administrative structures, the Vandals in North Africa used Roman cities and ports, and the Franks under Clovis sought to connect with the Roman heritage through their conversion to Christianity. Perhaps the most important element of Roman continuity was the Church. While the political structures in the West disintegrated, the Christian Church remained a stable institution. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, developed into a moral and later also a political authority. Monasteries became centers of education and preservation of ancient knowledge. The Latin language, which lived on in the administrations and in the liturgy, connected the different regions of Europe. In this way, a cultural bond was formed that, despite all the political fragmentation, kept alive the idea of a common Roman Christian identity. Roman architecture and technology also had a lasting influence on Europe. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and amphitheaters were reminders of the greatness of the empire for a long time. Many buildings continue to be used or served as models for medieval and modern architecture. The triumphal arch, the basilica, the dome, all these forms found their way into the architecture of churches, castles, and cathedrals. But the Roman heritage was not only preservation, but also transformation. The Germanic peoples who had conquered the empire brought their own traditions with them and merged them with what they found. This gave rise to a new, mixed culture that formed the basis for medieval Europe. Christianity, which Rome once persecuted and then embraced, became the dominant force. It connected people across language and tribal boundaries and gave Europe a common identity that was far stronger than political unity. So when you look at the end of Rome, you can't just see the downfall. Rather, it was a transition. The empire as a political entity collapsed, but its cultural, religious, and legal achievements lived on. The idea of Rome, the idea of a civilized order, a common culture, and a universal claim, remained and was renewed in ever new forms.